I don't think I'll ever sit on a hotel balcony again. Not after what happened. It started last fall. I had been feeling burned out, long hours at work, my social life in shambles, and a breakup that left me questioning everything. I decided to book a solo trip to a small beach town I'd never heard of. The idea was simple. No itinerary, no expectations. Just me, the ocean, and a stack of books. The town was perfect, quiet, with a single main street lined by shops selling saltwater taffy and weathered seashells. The hotel was exactly what I'd hoped for. Cheap but clean, with a private balcony overlooking the ocean. I arrived late in the afternoon, unpacked, and sat outside to watch the sun dip below the waves. The breeze was cool, the sound of the surf soothing. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. That's when I noticed him. He was standing on the balcony of the hotel room directly across from mine, separated only by the narrow alley between the two wings of the building. His room was dark except for the faint glow of the setting sun, but I could make out the silhouette of a man. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, facing my direction. At first, I thought he might be enjoying the same view I was, but the longer I sat, the clearer it became. He wasn't looking at the ocean. He was looking at me. I felt a jolt of discomfort, but told myself it was no big deal. Maybe he was zoning out, lost in his own thoughts. People do that. I went back inside, locked the door behind me, and tried not to think about it. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about the man on the balcony. Who was he? What was he doing there? I told myself I was being ridiculous, letting my imagination get the better of me. Still, I double-checked the lock on the sliding glass door before climbing into bed. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the curtains and the sound of seagulls outside. I shook off the lingering unease from the night before, chalked it up to travel nerves, and decided to spend the day exploring the town. It was a beautiful day, and by the time I got back to the hotel that evening, I was pleasantly tired and ready to relax. I stepped out onto the balcony with a glass of wine, letting the cool ocean breeze wash over me. And then I saw him again. He was standing in the same spot, facing my direction. But this time it was different. The light from his room was on now, illuminating his face. He was older than I'd guessed, maybe in his late 40s, with graying hair and an expression that was impossible to read. His gaze was locked on me, unblinking. I tried to ignore him, sipping my wine and pretending I hadn't noticed. But the longer I sat, the more oppressive his presence felt. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I went inside, pulled the curtains shut, and sat on the edge of the bed, my heart pounding. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the hotel walls made me jump. Every gust of wind sounded like a knock at the door. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamt of shadows moving behind the thin fabric of the curtains. The next morning, I decided to mention it to the hotel receptionist. I wasn't sure what I expected her to do. Maybe check if anyone else had complained or give me some reassurance that he was just another guest, harmless and oblivious. But when I brought it up, her face shifted into something unreadable. "Which room did you say?" she asked, her voice careful. "Across the alley's second floor. The one with the yellow curtains," I said. She stared at me for a moment too long. "That room's vacant," she said finally. "No one's booked there for weeks." "You're sure?" "I've seen someone on the balcony. Twice now." Her expression didn't change. "I'm sure." For the rest of the day, I couldn't concentrate on anything. I wandered the beach, browsed the shops, tried to distract myself, but my mind kept circling back to that room. Who was he? If the room was vacant, then why was he there? By the time night fell, I was too tired to think straight. I told myself the receptionist must have been mistaken. Maybe the room was double booked, or maybe she'd been looking at the wrong records. That had to be it. Still, when I stepped out onto the balcony that night, my stomach churned with anxiety. The other balcony was dark now, its sliding door closed. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for something, movement, a light, anything. But it stayed empty. Finally, I let myself relax. Maybe this was the end of it. I went back inside, left the curtains slightly open, and climbed into bed. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to a sound I couldn't place. A faint scraping like metal against glass. Groggy and disoriented, I turned toward the balcony and froze. The sliding door was open. Just a crack, but enough for the wind to whistle through. My stomach dropped as I stared at it, the shadows on the curtains shifting slightly with the breeze. And then I saw him. He was standing just outside the door, his face inches from the glass. His expression was blank, his eyes unblinking. For a moment, neither of us moved. I couldn't breathe. My body felt like it had turned to stone. Then he smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips. I scrambled out of bed and ran to the door, slamming it shut and locking it. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone and dialed the front desk. The receptionist answered groggily, and I could barely get the words out. "There's someone on my balcony," I said. "Please call the police." She paused. "Ma'am, you're on the 3rd floor. There's no way someone could get to your balcony." I didn't stay another night. I packed my bags and left as soon as the sun rose. The memory of his smile burned into my mind. To this day, I don't know who or what he was, but sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up to the sound of scraping glass and feel the weight of eyes on me, just outside the window. And I'll remember that smile, that terrible, knowing smile. Let's start a new story. At first, it wasn't dramatic. No sudden darkness, no gasps of realization. Just a subtle shift in the night sky that most people were too busy scrolling through their phones or binge-watching shows to observe. But I saw it. I was walking home from my late shift at the diner. The streets empty except for the occasional flicker of a street lamp. I liked to look at the stars as I walked, something comforting about their constancy. But that night, when I glanced up, they weren't there. The moon still hung in the sky, pale and distant, but the stars? Gone. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, craning my neck. Maybe it was cloud cover, I thought, though the sky was impossibly clear. Maybe light pollution? But this was a small town, surrounded by miles of dark farmland. No, the stars were just gone. The next day, I casually mentioned it to my coworker, Sarah. She looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "You sure you didn't hit your head or something?" she asked, smirking. "No, seriously. Look tonight," I insisted. But when I left the diner that evening, she was already gone. So I walked home again, and again, the stars weren't there. This went on for 3 nights. By the 4th night, something shifted. I didn't notice it until I passed the corner of 4th and Maple, where the old bookstore used to be. The air felt heavier, like the humidity before a storm, but the sky was still clear. And then I saw it, a figure standing under the flickering street lamp. At first, I thought it was just someone waiting for a ride, their silhouette cast long and jagged by the weak light. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't moving. No shuffle of feet, no breath pluming in the cold night air. They were too still, as though they were trying not to be noticed. "Hey," I called out, my voice tentative. "You okay?" No response. I stepped closer, and the figure tilted its head just slightly. The movement was unnatural, as if it didn't fully understand how to mimic human gestures. My pulse quickened, but I couldn't stop walking forward. Something about it drew me in a magnetic pull I couldn't explain. The figure stepped into the light, and I stopped breathing. It wasn't human. Its shape suggested a man, a tall, lanky frame, long limbs, but its surface was wrong. Its skin rippled like ink dropped in water, and its face, it didn't have one. Just a smooth, featureless surface that seemed to drink in the light around it. I took a step back, my instinct for self-preservation finally kicking in. But before I could turn and run, the thing raised a hand, thin, almost skeletal, and pointed at the sky. I don't know why I looked. Maybe curiosity, maybe fear, or maybe it was something deeper, something primal that I didn't understand. But when I looked up, my heart dropped into my stomach. The stars were back. No, not back. They were wrong. The constellations were twisted, warped into grotesque shapes that felt alive. Orion's belt was bent into a jagged, snarling maw, and the Big Dipper had become a hand, reaching down toward the earth. The stars themselves burned brighter than they ever should have, their light pulsing like a heartbeat. I stumbled backward, my gaze snapping back to the figure under the lamp. It hadn't moved, but somehow it felt closer. It tilted its head again, its featureless face angled toward the sky. And then it spoke, though its mouth never moved. "Do you see them?" The voice wasn't a sound. It was inside my head, low and resonant, vibrating in a way that made my teeth ache. "What are they?" I managed to whisper, my throat dry. It didn't answer. Instead, it took a step forward, and I bolted. I ran like I'd never run before, the sound of my own breathing deafening in my ears. When I finally reached my apartment, I slammed the door behind me and locked it, as if a deadbolt could stop whatever that thing was. For hours, I sat in my kitchen, the lights on, gripping the phone like a lifeline. I thought about calling someone, Sarah, the police, anyone, but what would I even say? "Hi, I saw a faceless ink monster under a street lamp, and now the stars are alive." Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep at the kitchen table. When I woke up, the world had changed. The sun never rose that day. The sky remained a deep, bruised purple, as if the stars had swallowed the light. People noticed now. The news was flooded with reports of the missing sun, though no one mentioned the stars or the figures. I tried to go about my day as normally as possible, but the unease in the air was palpable. People whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting to the sky as if they expected it to fall. That night, I walked home again. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd see it again, the figure, and it would have answers. Or maybe I just wanted to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. The figure was waiting for me, just like before, but this time, it wasn't alone. Dozens of them stood along the street, their inky forms barely distinguishable from the shadows. Each one pointed to the sky, their collective silence more oppressive than any sound. In the sky, it had changed again. The constellations were no longer just twisted shapes. They were moving. The snarling maw of Orion's belt opened and closed, the stars flickering like teeth grinding together. The hand of the Big Dipper reached lower, its fingertips brushing the horizon. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The figures began to move, their steps slow and deliberate, all heading in the same direction, toward the center of town. I don't know what compelled me to follow them, but I did. When we reached the town square, the figures gathered in a circle, their featureless faces tilted skyward. In the center of the circle, the ground began to shift. The asphalt cracked and crumbled, revealing a deep, yawning void that pulsed with the same eerie light as the stars. The figures turned to me, and one stepped forward, its hand outstretched. "They're waiting," it said, the voice like a distant echo. "It's time." I didn't ask who or what, because deep down, I already knew. Let's start a new story. The small town of Green Hollow had a charm that lured people in. Quiet streets, warm sunlight filtering through old oak trees, and houses that looked plucked from a postcard. I hadn't planned to stay long. My job as a traveling insurance adjuster kept me moving, and Green Hollow was just another dot on my map, another claim to investigate. But something about the way the town seemed untouched by time made me linger. I checked into a bed and breakfast, intent on a quick stay. It started with a single, mundane detail, a flower shop. I first noticed it on my second day in town while walking back from the local diner. The shop was small, its wooden sign painted with looping letters that read the blooming basket. Its window displayed a cascade of vibrant flowers spilling from wicker baskets, and the scent of roses and lavender hung faintly in the air. I peeked inside but didn't go in. An elderly woman behind the counter caught my eye and waved. I smiled, nodded, and moved on. The next day I saw it again, only different. The wooden sign now read petals and posies, and the display window featured cacti and succulents instead of flowers. I frowned, chalking it up to a bad memory. Maybe I misread it the first time. This time, the shop looked empty, no elderly woman, no lights inside. I shrugged it off and kept walking. By the third day, I couldn't ignore it. The flower shop had changed again. The sign now read Wildflower Wonders, and the storefront was overgrown with ivy, its windows nearly obscured. I stared uneasy. I was certain this wasn't my imagination. But when I asked the woman running the bed and breakfast about it, she just laughed and said, "You've been working too hard." That shop's been Blooming Basket for 30 years. Mrs. Hargrove wouldn't change a thing. I decided to test myself the next morning. I walked deliberately to the shop, camera in hand. The sign still read the Blooming Basket, just as the woman had said. I snapped a picture and glanced at it for confirmation. There it was, the sign, the flowers in the display, even Mrs. Hargrove arranging bouquets behind the counter. Feeling vindicated, I went about my day. That night, when I scrolled through my photos, the picture was wrong. The shop's name wasn't the Blooming Basket. The sign in the photo read Petals and Posies, and the window was filled with succulents again. My chest tightened. I deleted the photo, convincing myself it was some bizarre glitch, but I couldn't shake the unease. The next day, the shop wasn't there at all. The space where it should have been was now a boarded-up building with a rusted sign that read closed for renovations. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring at the cracked windows and peeling paint. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. A man passing by noticed my confusion and stopped. "Something wrong?" he asked. "The flower shop," I said, my voice shaking. "It's gone. It was right here yesterday." He gave me a blank look. "There hasn't been a flower shop here for a long time," he said. "Mrs. Hargrove passed away years ago. This place has been empty ever since." I left that conversation rattled, determined to figure out what was happening. I started asking around town, pressing people for details about the shop, but every answer I got contradicted the last. Some people said Mrs. Hargrove had retired and moved away. Others swore the shop had been destroyed in a fire a decade ago. No one could agree, and the more I asked, the more distant and wary people became. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, replaying every strange detail, every inconsistency, until my thoughts spiraled. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke suddenly to a sound outside my window, a faint rustling, like leaves brushing against glass. When I looked, I saw nothing but the shadow of the oak tree swaying in the breeze. The next morning, I walked past the spot where the flower shop had been, half expecting it to be something new. But the boarded-up building remained unchanged. For the first time, I let myself consider that maybe I was losing my mind. But then I saw the note. A small scrap of paper fluttered against the door, pinned by a nail. It hadn't been there the day before. I approached cautiously, the hairs on my neck standing on end. The note was written in spidery handwriting, its message simple. "You've been chosen. Don't look again." I ripped the note from the door and shoved it into my pocket, my heart pounding. Chosen for what? Was this some elaborate prank? I glanced around the street, searching for anyone watching, but it was deserted. That night, I locked my door and sat in my room, staring at the note. Its message filled me with an unnamed dread, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Something about the phrasing felt final, like a warning I was meant to heed but wouldn't. The next morning, I avoided the street entirely. I packed my bags, planning to leave town and file my report from the next city. But as I loaded my car, I saw it again, the flower shop. This time, it was impossibly vibrant. The sign glowed faintly, reading Eternal Bloom, and the flowers inside looked unnaturally alive, their colors too bright, their petals too perfect. They seemed to shimmer, as though breathing. I knew I shouldn't, but I stepped closer, compelled. The scent of flowers was intoxicating, overpowering, and the air seemed to hum with unseen energy. When I looked through the window, I saw her, Mrs. Hargrove, or someone who looked like her, standing behind the counter. She was watching me, her expression serene but wrong, too still, too fixed. Her eyes met mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of vertigo, as if the ground beneath me had tilted. Her lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear, but somehow understood. "You shouldn't have looked." I stumbled back, my chest tightening. When I turned to run, I found myself on a different street entirely. The familiar oaks of Green Hollow were gone, replaced by towering, unfamiliar buildings. The air was dense, humid, and the sky above was a strange, mottled gray. I've been wandering this place for hours, maybe days. The streets loop endlessly, leading me back to the same spot, the flower shop. It's always different, but always waiting. I can't leave. I don't think I ever will. If you ever pass through Green Hollow and see the Blooming Basket, don't go inside. Don't even look. And if you see a note on the door, for the love of God, don't read it. Let's start a new story. I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped into my apartment. The air felt thick, heavy in a way that made my skin crawl. Everything looked the same. The couch, the kitchen table, the photo of my sister and me laughing at the beach last summer. But it felt off, like a stage set made to fool someone who didn't know any better. The feeling was faint at first, easy to ignore. But it got worse. It started with a plant, a small fern I kept on my windowsill, one I'd barely paid attention to except for the occasional watering. One morning I noticed it had grown taller, maybe 4 inches, which seemed odd, but I didn't think much of it. Plants grow. That's what they do. The next day, it was taller still, its leaves brushing against the top of the window pane. By the third day, it had completely blocked out the light. Its stems were unnaturally thick, tangled like veins, and the tips of its leaves curled inward, as if searching for something. When I touched one of the fronds, it shuddered under my hand. It wasn't just alive. It felt aware. I ripped the thing out of its pot, dumping it in a trash bag and dragging it outside. My fingers were coated in something slick and sticky, not dirt but something darker. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I scrubbed them clean. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. The next day, I woke up to find the fern back on my windowsill, as healthy and vibrant as ever. Its fronds swayed faintly, even though there was no breeze. I threw it out again, this time driving to a park 10 miles away and tossing it into a dumpster. When I returned home, it was there, waiting for me. A single frond was pressed against the glass like a hand. Watching, I stopped sleeping in the bedroom after that. Around the same time, I started losing time. Not just seconds or minutes, but entire stretches of my day gone, erased as if they'd never happened. I'd blink, and suddenly it was nighttime, the TV blaring static, my phone dead in my hand. Sometimes I'd find myself standing in strange places, the middle of my kitchen, the edge of my bathtub, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. I started writing things down, keeping a notebook to track my days. It didn't help. I'd wake up to find pages missing or crossed out, replaced with unfamiliar handwriting. The words were messy, scrawled in looping patterns that didn't quite form letters. But there was one thing I could read, repeated over and over. You aren't you. At first, I thought someone was breaking in, playing some twisted prank. But the locks were always intact, the windows bolted shut. I set up a camera in the living room, hoping to catch whoever or whatever was doing this. When I played the footage back the next morning, I saw myself sitting on the couch, staring straight into the lens. I didn't move. I didn't blink. For 6 hours, I just sat there, my expression blank, my hands resting on my knees. I didn't remember any of it. The next time I watched the footage, something else caught my eye. In the corner of the screen, just for a split second, a shadow moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The shape was wrong, jagged and too tall to be human. It flickered in and out of view like a bad signal. When I tried to rewind, the screen went black. The camera overheated and never worked again. The worst part was the people around me. They started acting differently. My friend Lauren called one afternoon, her voice strained. "Are you okay?" she asked. "You sounded weird on the phone earlier." "I didn't call you," I said. There was a long pause. "Yeah, you did. This morning. You kept asking me if I'd ever seen, I don't know, the inside of myself." I thought it was a joke, but she broke off, and I could hear the fear in her voice. "That wasn't you, was it?" I hung up without answering. My reflection was the next thing to change. It started small, subtle delays, like it wasn't quite in sync with me. Then it began smiling when I wasn't, its lips pulling back just a second too soon. Once I caught it standing still while I turned to grab a towel. It tilted its head, studying me like I was the one trapped behind the glass. I stopped looking in mirrors after that. Then there were the notes. They started showing up around my apartment, scrawled in the same unfamiliar handwriting as before. On the bathroom mirror, "It sees you." Tucked into my jacket pocket, "Don't sleep." Scribbled on the inside of my closet door in red ink that smelled faintly metallic, "You'll let it in." I wasn't alone. I could feel it, always just out of reach. Sometimes, when the apartment was silent, I'd hear faint whispers coming from the walls. They weren't words exactly, just a low murmur like someone breathing too close to my ear. One night, I woke up to find myself standing in the hallway, staring at my own bedroom door. My hands were clenched into fists and my knuckles were bleeding. There were scratches on the door, deep gouges that spelled out one word. Why? I don't know how much time has passed since all this started. The days blur together, and the nights stretch too long. I've stopped trying to keep track. Every time, I think I've found a moment of peace. The fern is there, growing impossibly tall in the corner of my eye. Or my reflection is watching me from a darkened window. Or I find another note, more frantic than the last. It's inside you now. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's something I let in or something that was always there waiting. All I know is that the more I fight it, the stronger it becomes. My hands move on their own now, writing things I can't read, opening doors I don't remember unlocking. And then there's the newest note, written in my own handwriting this time, pinned to the fridge with a magnet. You're ready. Ready for what? I don't know. Maybe I'll never know. Maybe I'm not supposed to. But the whispers are louder now. And when I look in the mirror, my reflection doesn't even try to pretend anymore. It just stands there, smiling, waiting. Let's start a new story. I'm not sure when I first noticed it. The glitch. That's what I call it now, but at the time, it didn't seem like anything at all. Just a tiny hiccup in the rhythm of my day, so small it was easier to shrug off and think about. It was a Tuesday, I think, when I walked past the bakery on 9th Street and saw the same man twice. I mean exactly the same. Same brown coat, same black scarf, same gray hair swept to the side. The first time, he was sitting outside at a table, sipping coffee and reading a paper. The second time, not 20 feet down the street, he was standing in line inside the bakery, holding a baguette. My brain stumbled over the impossibility of it for a second before smoothing it over. Must be twins, I thought. Or maybe I just imagined it. Whatever. But then it happened again. And again. I saw a woman in a bright red coat walk past me at the park, her phone pressed to her ear. A minute later, she walked past me again from the same direction. I waited for her to circle back, but she never did. A man on my train was staring at his laptop screen as I got off, then was suddenly walking ahead of me on the platform. Small things, strange things. But it wasn't like the world stopped spinning. These were easy to chalk up to coincidence or déjà vu. That's what I told myself, anyway, until it wasn't. It started to ramp up about 2 weeks ago. I was at the grocery store, browsing the pasta aisle, when a woman's voice said, "Excuse me." I stepped aside without looking up, and she pushed her cart past me. I didn't think much of it, until she passed me again a few seconds later. And again, "Excuse me," she said in the exact same tone, the same cadence as she brushed by a third time. I froze, gripping the cart handle, and watched her walk away. When I turned down another aisle, I saw her standing at the far end, her back to me, motionless. I left the cart and walked out of the store. That night, I dreamed I was walking through an endless hallway, every door opening into another hallway exactly like the last. It was dim and cold, and my footsteps echoed forever. I kept hearing voices ahead of me, just out of sight, people laughing, arguing, whispering. When I finally reached them, they turned to look at me. Every single one of them had my face. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. My bedroom felt wrong. Too small, too quiet. I thought about calling someone, but who? What would I even say? Hey, I think I'm seeing things that don't make sense, and by the way, my dreams are really weird now too. Cool, right? I went back to sleep with the lights on. The next day, my boss called me into his office. He wanted to talk about my performance. I'd been missing deadlines, he said, showing up late, acting distracted, but I knew I hadn't. I told him I'd sent the Anderson report last week, just like he'd asked. His face darkened. "Anna, we haven't had an Anderson client in years." I went home early, my head spinning, and opened my laptop to check. The Anderson file wasn't in my sent folder. It wasn't in my drafts. It wasn't anywhere. Instead, there was a new folder on my desktop called Future. I didn't make it. Inside the folder was a single file, a .txt document titled Help. My stomach flipped as I opened it. It was blank. Before I could think too much about it, the file deleted itself. The glitches started piling up after that. I'd leave my apartment and return to find small changes. My couch moved an inch to the left. The painting above the mantel replaced with one I'd never seen before, a black and white landscape of trees that seemed to shimmer when I stared at it too long. My reflection in the bathroom mirror lagged behind my movements, just for a split second, but enough to make my skin crawl. One morning, my phone alarm didn't go off. I woke naturally and checked the time. 7:15 a.m. 2 hours passed when I should have been up. Except the sun was still down. The clock on the microwave said it was 2:47. My computer said 11:34. I stared at the windows, at the dark sky outside. What time is it? My neighbor, Mrs. Eckhart, knocked on my door later that day, holding a Tupperware of cookies. She smiled too wide, her dentures flashing. "Thought you could use a treat, dear," she said. I thanked her, even though I'd never spoken to her before. She'd always been a distant figure, a shadow I passed in the hallway or saw through her window, watching TV. But now she seemed off. Her voice was too high, her movements too smooth, like a puppet's. As she turned to leave, I asked, "Hey, what time is it?" She paused, her hand still on the doorknob. Slowly, she looked over her shoulder. "You'll find out soon enough," she said, and then she was gone. The cookies were still warm. I didn't eat them. The final straw came last night. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling my phone, when the screen froze. No big deal, it happens sometimes. But this time, the screen didn't just freeze. It turned black, then white, and then a text appeared. "Anna, do you know where you are?" I dropped the phone like it had shocked me. When I picked it up again, the home screen was normal. No text, no glitch. But I wasn't alone anymore. I heard footsteps in the kitchen, soft but deliberate. I grabbed a knife from the coffee table and crept toward the noise, my heart pounding. The kitchen was empty. No sign of a break-in. No sound. I turned back to the living room and saw myself standing there. Not a reflection. Not a hallucination. Me, wearing the same clothes, holding the same knife. She smiled a tight, unnatural grin. "You're almost ready," she said. "For what?" My voice cracked. Her smile widened. "To wake up." I blinked, and she was gone. Just me, standing in the empty apartment, knife trembling in my hand. I haven't slept since. The clock says it's 3 a.m., but I don't trust it. I don't trust anything anymore. I keep hearing Mrs. Eckhart's voice in my head. Over and over. "You'll find out soon enough." Let's start a new story. It started on a rainy night, the kind where the streets shimmer with reflections of neon signs, and the sound of water dripping feels louder than it should. I was walking home from work, cutting through the old industrial district like I always did. The place had a certain melancholy charm. Abandoned warehouses, cracked sidewalks sprouting weeds, streetlights that buzzed faintly like they were sharing secrets. That night, though, the route felt different. Smaller, tighter. The air seemed to hum, as if the world were holding its breath. That's when I saw him. He was standing under a flickering street lamp, his back to me. He wore a faded brown coat that seemed too big for him, the hem brushing against the ground. His head was tilted slightly upward, looking at the street lamp like it had spoken his name. For a moment, I thought he might be homeless, just another shadow in the city's underbelly. But then I noticed something strange. The rain wasn't touching him. It wasn't like he was sheltered under an umbrella. The drops simply stopped a few inches from his body, pooling midair before sliding off into nothing. I froze. Something about him felt off, like he didn't quite fit into the scene, like he'd been edited into the frame of reality by an unsteady hand. "Hey," I called out, more to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining things than anything else. The man turned slowly, like he had all the time in the world. His face was pale, gaunt, with sharp features that looked almost too precise. His eyes, though, they were wrong. They were bright, impossibly bright, like they'd been lit from within. He didn't say anything, just stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment before smiling. It wasn't a kind smile. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Instead of answering, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small object, holding it out toward me. It was a key, old, ornate, with intricate engravings that seemed to shift when I looked at them too long. For you, he said, his voice soft and hollow, like it was echoing from far away. I didn't take it. Something in my gut screamed not to. What's it for? I asked. The man tilted his head, his smile widening. You'll know when the time comes. That's when the streetlight buzzed violently, flickered twice, and went out. When the light came back, he was gone. Just like that. No sound of footsteps, no shadow retreating into the distance. Just gone. I should have gone straight home, forgotten the whole thing, chalked it up to fatigue or a stress-induced hallucination. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself walking back to the same spot the next night. Then the next. Something about that encounter stuck with me, gnawed at the edges of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. The third night, I found the key. It was lying on the sidewalk, exactly where the man had stood. I didn't touch it at first. I just stared at it, my breath fogging in the cold air. It shouldn't have been there. I should have walked away, but I didn't. The moment my fingers closed around the key, I felt a jolt. Not pain, exactly, but a deep, resonant vibration that rattled my bones. The street around me seemed to blur, the sounds of the city growing distant, muffled, as if I were sinking underwater. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. Everything snapped back into focus, leaving me standing there, clutching the key like an idiot. I told myself I'd just take it home, throw it in a drawer, and forget about it. But as soon as I crossed my apartment threshold, the key began to grow warm in my hand. I looked down and saw that the engravings had changed. They now formed a shape, an arrow, pointing toward my bedroom. I don't know why I followed it. Curiosity? Stupidity? Something deeper, more instinctual? Whatever the reason, I found myself standing in front of my bedroom door, holding the key up to the lock. It shouldn't have fit. My door didn't even have a keyhole. But as soon as I pressed the tip of the key to the wood, the door creaked open on its own. Inside was not my bedroom. It was hard to describe. The space felt infinite yet claustrophobic, shifting constantly like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The floor was a mosaic of black and white tiles that rippled like water when I stepped on them. The walls, if they were walls, were made of shifting light, their colors bleeding into one another like an oil slick. And the air, it buzzed, alive with a low, thrumming energy that made my teeth ache. In the center of the room stood a table. On it was a box, small and unassuming, with no hinges or seams. My feet carried me toward it before I realized what I was doing. The box wasn't locked, but it didn't open easily. It felt like it was resisting me, fighting against my hands. When I finally pried it open, I found nothing. At least, that's what I thought at first. But then I noticed the shadows in the room shifting, pooling around me like liquid ink. They began to rise, taking shape, forming me. My own face stared back at me, its features warped and exaggerated, like a funhouse mirror come to life. The doppelganger smiled, not a kind smile. You should have left it alone, it said, its voice a distorted echo of my own. I stumbled back, the box falling from my hands. The shadows surged forward, enveloping me, and for a moment, I felt like I was falling, not downward, but sideways or maybe inward. When I hit the ground, I was back in my apartment. The key was gone. So was the box. At first, I thought I'd escaped, that it was over. But now, every time I pass a mirror, I see something wrong. My reflection doesn't move quite right. It lags just for a fraction of a second, but enough to notice. Sometimes, when I'm not looking directly at it, I see its lips moving, whispering, and every night, without fail, I hear a soft knock on my bedroom door. The door I no longer dare to open. Let's start a new story. One morning, wrapped in crinkly brown paper and tied with a bit of twine. There was no note, no name, just the flowers. I wasn't used to receiving gifts, especially not from anonymous admirers, so I chalked it up to a mistake. Maybe someone had dropped them off at the wrong desk. I left them there all day, but no one came to claim them. By the end of my shift, I decided to take them home. Waste not, right? The next morning, there was another bouquet. This time, red roses. My stomach flipped when I saw them. There was still no note, and when I asked around, no one admitted to knowing anything about them. My co-workers teased me about having a secret admirer, but something about it felt off. I left the roses where they were, thinking maybe whoever sent them would come forward. They didn't. On the third day, the flowers were orchids, delicate, white, and eerily perfect. That's when I started getting nervous. Whoever was sending them wasn't making a mistake, and it wasn't just a joke. They knew where I worked. They knew where I sat. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe someone had a crush and was too shy to say anything, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping into my chest. I decided to leave the orchids behind when I went home that night, hoping it would send a message. When I returned the next morning, the bouquet was gone. In its place was a single note written on a scrap of plain white paper. "You forgot these." My breath caught in my throat. I glanced around the office, scanning for anyone watching me, but everything seemed normal. Too normal. My co-workers were chatting, typing, drinking their coffee like nothing had happened. I crumpled the note and shoved it into my pocket, suddenly feeling exposed. I didn't mention the flowers to anyone again. For a while, nothing happened. No flowers, no notes. I started to relax, convincing myself that whoever had been behind it had gotten bored. Maybe it had been harmless, just a misguided attempt at flirtation. I even laughed about it with a friend over drinks one weekend, feeling silly for how paranoid I'd been. Then, 2 weeks later, I found the photo. It was tucked under my windshield wiper after work, a Polaroid of me sitting at my desk. My stomach lurched as I stared at it, my hands trembling. It wasn't a picture I'd taken, and it wasn't from any office event. The angle was wrong, the lighting too dim. Someone had taken it from outside, through the office window. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I drove straight to my best friend Maddie's place and begged her to let me crash on her couch. She didn't ask many questions, just handed me a glass of wine and told me I could stay as long as I needed. I didn't tell her about the photo. I couldn't. Saying it out loud would make it too real. For the next few days, I tried to act normal. I went to work, went home, and forced myself to believe it was over. But the photo lingered in my mind like a bad dream. Who had taken it? And why? The answer came sooner than I expected. It was a Friday night, and I was working late, trying to catch up on a project with a tight deadline. The office was empty, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. I was so absorbed in my work that I didn't notice the movement at first, a faint shadow flickering across the far wall. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The shadow moved again, closer this time. My heart pounded as I turned, expecting to see a co-worker or a janitor. But there was no one there, just the empty office, stretching into the dimly lit hallway. I grabbed my bag and practically ran to the elevator, my pulse thundering in my ears. When I reached the parking garage, I kept my keys gripped tight in my hand, the pointed end of the key sticking out between my fingers like a makeshift weapon. The garage was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies every sound. My footsteps, the distant hum of an engine, the faint scrape of a shoe on concrete. I reached my car and fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking. As I opened the door, I felt it, a presence behind me, so close I could feel the heat of their breath on the back of my neck. "Nice night for working late," a voice said, low and smooth. I spun around, my heart in my throat. There he was, a man in his mid-30s, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks. He looked completely normal, the kind of guy you'd pass on the street without a second thought. But his eyes, they were wrong. Too intense. Too hungry. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice wavering. He smiled, his hands in his pockets. "Just wanted to say hello. You've been working so hard lately. Thought you might need a little company." My blood ran cold. He knew. He'd been watching me, at work, at home, everywhere. "I don't know who you are," I said, stepping back. "But you need to leave me alone." His smile didn't falter. "Come on now. Don't be like that. I just want to get to know you." I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and peeled out of the garage, not caring if I ran a red light or two. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the wheel. I didn't go home that night or the night after. Instead, I went to the police. They took my statement, but without proof, there wasn't much they could do. No name, no evidence. Just a photo, a note, and a bad feeling. It's been 3 weeks now, and I haven't seen him again. The flowers have stopped. The notes have stopped, but I know he's still out there waiting. Every night, I check my locks 3 times. Every time I step outside, I scan the street for his face. And every time I close my eyes, I see his smile, sharp and cold, like a knife pressing against my skin. I don't know what he wants. I don't know what he's waiting for. But I know one thing for sure. He's not done with me yet. Let's start a new story. I've always had a routine. Wake up at 7:15 a.m., brew a pot of coffee while scrolling through the headlines, get ready, and leave for work by 8 o'clock sharp. My life has always been tidy, predictable, and manageable. Until the morning, I woke up 3 minutes late. The clock read 7:18 when my eyes opened. It was such a small, insignificant shift that I didn't think much of it. I rolled out of bed, still groggy, and shuffled to the kitchen. The coffee machine, which I swear I had loaded the night before, was empty. The scoop was gone, too. I spent a few minutes rummaging through cabinets before finding it in the fridge, sitting neatly beside a jar of olives I didn't buy. A small hiccup, I thought. Weird, but not alarming. On my way out, I noticed something stranger. My neighbor, a woman named Claire who walks her dachshund at precisely 7:50 every morning, was already outside. Her dog wasn't with her, and she was wearing an outfit I hadn't seen her in before, a sleek, white pantsuit. She stood on the sidewalk, staring at her phone, motionless. It was almost robotic. "Morning, Claire." I called out, but she didn't respond. Didn't even look up. She just stood there, scrolling with a mechanical flick of her thumb. I shrugged it off and headed to the train station. The usual rhythm of my commute was slightly off. The turnstile, I always used beep twice instead of once when I scanned my card. The train, normally packed at this hour, was only half full. Even the hum of the overhead lights felt different, lower, like a bass note reverberating just under the surface. Still, I told myself I was just overthinking things. But as I sat in my usual window seat, I spotted something impossible. A man walking across the platform below. He wore the exact same suit I had on, the same dark tie, the same brown shoes. His gait matched mine, long strides with a slight hitch in the left leg, thanks to an old soccer injury. As the train pulled away, I saw him glance up at me. Our eyes locked. It wasn't just that he looked like me. It was me. By the time I reached my stop, my stomach was in knots. I wanted to tell myself I was imagining things, that it was just a doppelganger, a freak coincidence. But my day kept unraveling. At the office, my nameplate was gone from my desk. Instead, it read Elliot Barnes. My inbox was empty, save for one email titled "Welcome to the team." I clicked on it, heart pounding. It was dated 3 months ago, addressed to someone named Elliot, and written in a style I didn't recognize. My coworkers greeted me by the wrong name all day, smiling warmly, like they'd known me forever. I decided to go home early. I needed space, time to figure out what was going on. But when I got back to my apartment building, my key didn't fit the lock. The door was the same, but the number, 4B, had been replaced with 7A. My breath hitched as I stepped back, scanning the building. Everything looked slightly off. The bricks were too clean, the ivy on the side was gone, and a new sign above the entrance read Horizon Residences. I hadn't seen it that morning. I stood there for several minutes, feeling the world slip further from my grasp. Eventually, I walked around the block, hoping maybe I'd come back to find everything as it should be. Instead, I saw myself again. This time, I wasn't in a suit. I was in sweatpants and a hoodie, crouched by a lamppost, tying my shoes. I froze, watching as my double stood and walked briskly toward the park. Without thinking, I followed. The park was wrong too. It was still a park, technically trees, benches, paths, but the layout had changed. Paths curved in impossible ways, looping into themselves, leading nowhere. The sky above was tinged with a color that didn't exist, like the green of a leaf, but somehow deeper, metallic. My double disappeared down a narrow trail, and I hurried after him, calling out, "Hey, wait!" The moment I turned the corner, the air shifted. My lungs felt heavy, like I'd stepped underwater. The trail opened into a clearing I'd never seen before, filled with people standing eerily still. They weren't moving, weren't talking, just standing perfectly spaced apart, each staring into the distance. Their faces were blank, devoid of expression. And every single one of them was me. Hundreds of versions of me, dressed in different clothes, frozen in mid-step or mid-thought or mid-life. One wore a birthday hat, holding a half-eaten slice of cake. Another was in a hospital gown and 4 bag attached to their wrist. One was sitting cross-legged, staring at their own hands. "What is this?" I whispered. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the heavy air. One of them, the one in the suit, turned to look at me. He smiled faintly, the way you might at an old friend. "You made it," he said. "Made it where?" I demanded. My voice cracked. The suited double took a step closer. The others remained frozen, a sea of me's in the background. "You're not supposed to notice," he said. His tone was calm, but the words hit me like a thunderclap. "Most people don't." "Notice what?" "This." He gestured around, his hands sweeping over the endless park of doppelgangers. "The bleed. The overlap. It's been happening for a while, hasn't it? Little things out of place. Faces you've seen but don't recognize. It's all part of the breakdown." "Breakdown of what?" I demanded, but I already knew the answer. The tightness in my chest told me before he spoke. "Reality," he said simply. "It's not built to hold all of us at once." I stumbled back, shaking my head. "This isn't real. You're not real." The suited version of me chuckled softly. "If that's true, then what does that make you?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My vision blurred, the edges of the clearing rippling like heat waves. I looked down at my hands and saw them flicker, translucent, like an old film reel stuttering through its frames. "I don't understand," I whispered. The suited me reached out, his hand resting on my shoulder. His touch was cold, heavy. "You will," he said. "You always do in the end." And then, just like that, I was back on the train. The lights hummed overhead, normal again, and the train car was full of passengers. My window seat was gone, taken by a teenager scrolling through their phone. Outside, the world looked exactly as it should, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something vital had slipped away. When I got home, my key worked, my door said 4B, and my neighbor's garage door was yellow again. But when I checked the mirror that night, my reflection smiled just a little too late. Let's start a new story. I was walking home from the bus stop after work, tired and distracted, my mind already on the leftover pizza in my fridge. The air was unusually still, and the setting sun cast a strange, coppery light over everything. I remember stopping at the corner where Pine Street met Riverdale, the two roads forming an awkward T-shape I'd walked 100 times before. But as I stepped off the curb, the world around me seemed to flicker, like an old TV losing its signal. It wasn't a full blackout, just a split second where everything went hazy, the colors bleeding together. When the world came back into focus, it was wrong. Pine Street was gone. In its place was a dirt path that wound through a forest of skeletal trees, their branches bare and twisted. The buildings along Riverdale looked abandoned, their windows shattered, their walls covered in thick vines. The air smelled different, too, damp and metallic, with an undertone of something sweet and rotten. I stood there, heart pounding, unsure whether to scream or laugh. I turned back the way I'd come, but the bus stop was no longer there. Just more trees, stretching endlessly into the horizon. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Another flicker, and everything was back to normal. Pine Street reappeared, the familiar houses and streetlights perfectly intact, as if nothing had happened. I even saw Mrs. Haddock, my elderly neighbor, watering her flowers like she always did. She waved at me, her expression calm and unbothered. I waved back, forcing a smile, and hurried inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. My room felt smaller, the air stifling, like the walls were closing in. I kept thinking about the forest, the dirt path, the smell of decay. But the rational part of my brain insisted it was just a hallucination, maybe a trick of the light combined with exhaustion. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Then it happened again. This time, I was at the grocery store, picking out apples. One moment, I was comparing prices on Gala and Honeycrisp. The next, the floor beneath my feet turned to cracked stone, and the fluorescent lights overhead vanished. I was standing in what looked like a ruined cathedral. The air was thick with smoke, and the distant sound of chanting echoed through the vast, shadowy space. I froze, clutching an apple like it was a lifeline, as a massive figure moved through the darkness. It was humanoid, but grotesquely tall, its head grazing the arched ceiling. Its arms were unnaturally long, ending in fingers that curled like talons. Its face, if it had one, was hidden beneath a shroud of writhing black tendrils. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt them, boring into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen chunk of stone, and shut my eyes, bracing for what? I don't know. Death, maybe. But when I opened them again, I was back in the grocery store. The apple was still in my hand, but it was bruised now, like I'd been gripping it too hard. No one around me seemed to have noticed anything. The old man by the bananas was still inspecting them with the same slow deliberation, and the cashier was chatting with a customer like nothing had happened. I left without buying anything. Over the next few days, the shifts came more frequently. They were unpredictable, sometimes lasting just a few seconds, other times stretching into minutes. I'd be in my apartment one moment, and the next I'd find myself in an alien city with buildings that shimmered like glass and pulsed like living organs. Or in a cavern lit by bioluminescent fungi, the air vibrating with a low, droning hum that seemed to resonate in my bones. Once, I found myself on a narrow bridge suspended over a chasm, so deep I couldn't see the bottom. The bridge swayed beneath my weight, and far below, something massive moved in the darkness. No matter where I went during these shifts, the sensation was always the same. I wasn't supposed to be there. The places were hostile, not in a way I could always see, but in the way they felt. Like the world itself was trying to reject me, pushing me out like a splinter. I tried telling my friends, but they didn't believe me. Stress, my roommate, Taylor said, her voice laced with thinly veiled concern. You've been working too much. Maybe you should take a break. When I pressed her, when I begged her to believe me, her expression shifted. For a moment, her face looked unfamiliar, her features too sharp, her eyes too dark. Then she blinked, and it was gone. I stopped talking about it after that. The final shift happened a week later. I was in my apartment sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. It wasn't on. I hadn't been able to bring myself to watch anything. The sound of human voices, even recorded ones, felt too jarring. The air in the room felt heavy, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should have. Then, without warning, the flicker came. This time, it wasn't brief. The apartment disappeared, replaced by a vast, featureless plain that stretched endlessly in every direction. The sky above was a sickly shade of yellow, with two suns hanging low on the horizon. The ground beneath me was soft and spongy, like walking on a giant tongue. I wasn't alone. There were figures in the distance, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They moved in unison, their heads tilted at odd angles, their limbs jerking unnaturally. I couldn't make out their faces, but I didn't need to. I could feel their attention, a collective focus zeroing in on me. One by one, they turned and began to move toward me, their movements jerky at first, then faster, more fluid. I ran. I didn't know where I was going. There was nowhere to go. The horizon didn't change, no matter how far I ran, and the figures kept coming, closing the distance. I could hear them now, the sound of their footsteps, wet and squelching against the ground. I tripped and fell, the spongy earth giving way beneath me. When I looked up, one of them was standing over me. Its face was blank, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin. But as I stared, the blankness began to shift, forming into something I recognized. It was my own face. I screamed, and the world flickered again. But this time I didn't come back. I'm still here, in this endless, yellow-skied plain. The figures are everywhere now, circling me, their faces all wearing mine. I don't know how long it's been. Days? Weeks? Time doesn't feel real here. I wonder if anyone's noticed I'm gone. Or maybe, just maybe, I'm still there in my apartment, sitting on the couch with my blank TV. Maybe I've shifted the other way, and what's left of me is watching. Waiting. Let's start a new story. It began the day I helped a man find his dog. I was walking back from the grocery store, balancing 2 heavy bags and regretting my decision to skip the car. The sun was setting, casting long, syrupy shadows over the quiet suburban street. That's when I saw him, a man in his late 40s, pacing on the corner near the park entrance. He had that anxious energy of someone looking for something important, his head swiveling side to side, hands cupped around his mouth. "Buddy, come on, boy," he called, his voice strained. As I approached, he turned toward me, his face lighting up like I was a godsend. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Have you seen a golden retriever? About ya high? Red collar?" He slipped his leash and bolted. I hadn't, but I felt bad for him. He looked genuinely distressed, and who wouldn't be if their dog had run off? I offered to help, setting my bags down and pulling out my phone to use as a flashlight. We combed the park for nearly an hour, calling Buddy into the darkness. Eventually, I spotted the dog near a cluster of trees, sniffing around like he had no idea his owner was losing his mind. The man was overjoyed, falling to his knees to hug the retriever like a lost child. He thanked me profusely, asking my name. I told him it was Lauren. "Well, Lauren," he said, beaming as he clipped the leash back on. "You're an angel. I owe you one." He hesitated, then extended a hand. "I'm Frank, by the way." I shook his hand briefly, eager to get back home before my groceries defrosted. He seemed harmless, just an overwhelmed pet owner having a bad day. As I walked away, I could feel his gratitude radiating behind me. I told myself I'd done a good deed and thought nothing more of it. 2 days later, I saw him again. I was coming out of my apartment building, juggling my keys and a reusable coffee cup, when I noticed him standing across the street. He wasn't looking at me, or at least I didn't think he was, until he lifted a hand in a small wave. Startled, I hesitated before nodding back. What were the odds? I didn't even know he lived in this neighborhood. Maybe he was just passing through. Still, something about the encounter felt off. Too deliberate, like he'd been waiting. Later that night, I found a note slid under my door. "Thank you again for helping me find Buddy. You have such a kind heart. Frank." My stomach tightened. How did he know where I lived? I told myself it wasn't that weird. I had mentioned the name of my building during our search. He must have figured it out. It wasn't a big deal, was it? The following week, Frank's appearances became more frequent. I'd see him standing outside the grocery store, walking Buddy near the park, or leaning against a lamppost a block away from my apartment. Each time, he'd wave or smile, like we were old friends. It wasn't enough to accuse him of anything. It wasn't like he was trespassing or threatening me, but it was enough to make me uneasy. Then the gift started. It began with small things. A coffee cup left on my doorstep, a keychain shaped like a golden retriever, a neatly folded scarf. Each time, there was a note. "Thought you might like this. Frank." I didn't respond. I didn't even acknowledge them. I just threw them away and hoped he'd take the hint. But he didn't stop. The gifts escalated, an expensive candle, a framed photo of Buddy, and then one morning a pair of gloves in my exact size. That was the moment I realized he'd been watching me closely enough to know the small details of my life. The thought made my skin crawl. I started taking precautions, changing up my routes, leaving my apartment at odd hours, even sleeping with a chair propped under the doorknob. For a while it seemed to work. I didn't see him for almost 2 weeks, and I let myself believe it was over, until I found the photo. It was tucked into my mailbox, wrapped in a piece of plain white paper. At first, I thought it was junk mail, but when I unfolded it, my blood ran cold. It was a picture of me walking home from the grocery store, taken from a distance. My arms were full of bags, my head tilted slightly as if I'd heard something. The note beneath it read, "You're so beautiful when you're focused. I hope you're eating well." I didn't sleep that night. I kept every light in my apartment on, my phone clutched in my hand, ready to call the police. But what could I tell them? He hadn't technically done anything illegal. A picture, a few notes, they weren't threats. Not yet. The final straw came 3 nights later. I was lying in bed, trying to convince myself that I was safe, when I heard it, the faint scrape of something against my front door. My heart pounded as I crept to the peephole. There was nothing there. Just the empty hallway, bathed in flickering yellow light. But then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate scratching sound like someone dragging a nail across the wood. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The sound stopped, and for a moment, the silence was worse. Then a single piece of paper slid under the door. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to. I knew who it was from. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold it to my ear. When the police arrived, Frank was gone. They searched the building, but found no sign of him. The paper under my door was blank, except for a single sentence scrawled in the corner. I know you're scared, but you don't have to be. I moved out the next day, breaking my lease and leaving everything behind. I don't know where Frank is now, and I don't want to. All I know is that I'll never stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for the moment he decides he's not finished. Let's start a new story. To be a simple house-sitting gig. The job seemed like a dream. A week in a gorgeous, secluded home tucked away in the woods, miles from the nearest town. I had just graduated college and desperately needed time to think about what the hell I was going to do with my life. The house belonged to an old professor of mine, Dr. Sinclair, who was going abroad for a conference. She'd asked if I could keep an eye on things, water the plants, and feed her cat, Willow. Easy money, I thought. I couldn't have been more wrong. The house itself was breathtaking. It was an old Victorian manor that looked like it had been plucked straight out of a Gothic novel. Stained glass windows, a wraparound porch, and intricate woodwork everywhere. It sat at the end of a long, winding gravel road, surrounded by dense forest. Dr. Sinclair had mentioned the house was over 100 years old, but she'd renovated the inside. The first time I stepped through the front door, I was hit with the scent of lemon polish and old wood. Everything inside was pristine, like a museum exhibit frozen in time. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my mornings exploring the house, trying not to feel weird about how quiet it was. Willow was a sweet, lazy cat who mostly slept in a sunbeam by the bay window. I found the isolation refreshing, even peaceful. During the day, the house felt safe, inviting even, but at night, something changed. It started with a sound, faint at first, barely loud enough to register, a soft tapping, like fingernails brushing against glass. I heard it the first night just as I was about to fall asleep. My room was on the second floor, with a window overlooking the backyard and the woods beyond. At first, I thought it was a branch scraping against the glass, but when I got up to look, there was nothing there. Just darkness, thick and impenetrable, pressing against the window like a living thing. The tapping didn't stop. Every night, it returned, growing louder and more insistent. Sometimes it would come from the bedroom window. Other times, it was the kitchen or the living room. Always the same steady rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. By the fourth night, I was unraveling. Willow had started behaving strangely too, staring at the windows with wide, unblinking eyes. She would hiss at nothing, her fur bristling as if something unseen was in the room. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. I hadn't slept more than a couple of hours each night, and the isolation was starting to wear on me. On the fifth night, I heard footsteps. It was nearly 2 a.m. I'd given up trying to sleep and was sitting in the living room, wrapped in a blanket with Willow curled on my lap. The sound came from the back porch, a deliberate, measured tread of someone walking. My heart seized as I realized no one was supposed to be here. Dr. Sinclair hadn't mentioned a groundskeeper or neighbor, and the house was miles from any other property. I reached for my phone, but before I could call anyone, the footsteps stopped. Silence settled over the house like a heavy shroud. I sat frozen, straining to hear any sound, when a knock came at the door. It wasn't a polite knock. It was slow, heavy, deliberate. 3 solid thuds that reverberated through the house. Willow bolted from my lap, disappearing under the couch. My pulse was roaring in my ears as I stumbled to my feet. I didn't want to open the door. Every instinct screamed at me not to. But what if someone needed help? What if it was an emergency? I crept toward the door, my shaking hand reaching for the knob. Before I could touch it, a voice came from the other side. "Let me in." It was a man's voice. Low, gravelly, and unfamiliar. Something about it felt wrong. It wasn't angry or threatening. If anything, it sounded calm. Too calm. My throat went dry as I called out, "Who's there?" Silence. I looked through the peephole, but saw nothing. No one. Just the dark expanse of the porch. I stood there for what felt like hours, every muscle in my body screaming to move, to run, to hide. Finally, I backed away and locked myself in the bedroom, heart hammering as I barricaded the door with a chair. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on the back porch. They were large, clearly from boots, but they ended abruptly at the edge of the stairs. No tracks leading away, no sign of anyone leaving. Just a single set of prints, as if someone had appeared out of thin air and vanished the same way. I should have left then. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe it was stubbornness or embarrassment. Maybe I didn't want to explain to Dr. Sinclair that I'd fled her house in the middle of the night. Whatever the reason, I stayed. And that was my mistake. On the final night, the house came alive. I was lying in bed, every light in the house blazing, when the tapping started again. But this time it was different. It was everywhere. The windows, the walls, even the ceiling. A frantic, erratic rhythm that made the house feel like it was breathing. Willow was yowling from under the bed, a sound so guttural and terrified I barely recognized it. And then I heard the voice again. "Let me in." It was louder now, echoing through the house like it was coming from everywhere at once. My hands clamped over my ears, but it didn't stop. The walls were shaking, the windows rattling in their frames. And then it stopped. Silence. I thought it was over, until I saw the figure. It was standing in the backyard, just at the edge of the forest. Tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't make out any features, just a black silhouette against the trees. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. I ran. I didn't pack. I didn't turn off the lights. I grabbed my keys, ran to my car, and didn't stop driving until I was back in the city. Dr. Sinclair called me the next day, furious. She said the house was a mess. Lights on in every room, furniture overturned. She said Willow was gone. I didn't tell her what happened. I just apologized and hung up. I still see it sometimes. The figure. In my dreams. In the corner of my eye. Reflected in dark windows. It never moves. It never speaks. It just watches. And I think it's waiting for me to let it in. Let's start a new story. It was the kind of place that begged for whispers. Too big for one person, too old to feel entirely safe, too cheap to be anything but suspicious. But I was broke and tired of couch surfing after a messy breakup, and the landlord seemed more eager to offload the property than to answer my questions. "It's quiet," he said with a smile that didn't quite touch his eyes. "Perfect for someone looking to start fresh." The lilies greeted me on my first morning there, a subtle, sweet scent wafting through the air. I assumed it was left over from the previous tenant, a forgotten vase tucked away in some corner. But I searched the entire house and found nothing. No flowers, no air fresheners. Just empty rooms filled with shadows and the groan of wooden floors settling into themselves. The smell came and went over the next few days, always strongest at night, as if the house exhaled perfume while I slept. I told myself it was my imagination, or maybe some quirk of old plumbing. Then I started hearing the footsteps. They weren't loud, just soft, rhythmic creaks moving down the upstairs hallway. Always around the same time, just after midnight. The first night, I froze in bed, clutching the comforter and straining my ears. When the sound stopped, I convinced myself it was the house settling, the way old houses do. But the next night, they came again, steady and deliberate, like someone pacing just outside my bedroom door. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the hall, my pulse hammering in my ears. The beam of light swept over the peeling wallpaper, the dusty floorboards. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped, but the smell of lilies was overpowering, almost sickly. I hardly slept after that. A week later, I was unpacking the last of my boxes when I found the photo. It was tucked between the pages of an old book I didn't remember owning, a black and white snapshot of a woman standing on the porch of my house. She wore a simple dress and a wide-brimmed hat, her face tilted slightly as if looking toward the photographer. Something about her expression unsettled me. It wasn't joy or even stillness. It was almost expectant. The back of the photo had a date written in neat cursive, March 3rd, 1937. That night, the footsteps were louder. This time, they didn't stop at the hallway. They descended the stairs. I sat frozen in the living room, my hands gripping the edge of the couch as the sound moved closer, one creaking step at a time. When they reached the bottom, I turned on every light I could reach, flooding the house in harsh, artificial brightness. And that's when I saw her. She was standing by the window, the woman from the photograph. Her dress looked damp, clinging to her frame, and her hair hung in wet strands around her face. Her head tilted slightly, just like in the photo, as if examining me. But the part that made my stomach drop, the part that still haunts me, was the way her feet didn't touch the floor. I don't remember screaming, or grabbing my car keys, or driving away into the night. I just remember the way her eyes followed me as I bolted out the door, black and endless like the dark stretch of road ahead. I stayed with a friend that night, someone who didn't ask too many questions. But the next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the photo, the smell of lilies, the wet hem of her dress. Something about it all felt too specific, too deliberate to be random. So, I went to the library. The librarian was an older woman with wire-rimmed glasses and a sharpness to her voice that suggested she didn't appreciate interruptions. But when I mentioned the house, her demeanor shifted. "You bought that place?" she asked, leaning in closer. I explained what had happened, feeling ridiculous even as I said it. But she didn't laugh. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she opened a drawer and pulled out a yellowing newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local woman missing, believed dead." Underneath was a grainy photo of the same woman. Her name was Margaret Halston. She had lived in the house during the 1930s, a widow who kept to herself. One night, she vanished without a trace. The townspeople speculated she had fallen into the river that ran behind the property, swept away by the current. But her body was never found. "That house has history," the librarian said, lowering her voice. "People have moved in and out of there for decades. They always leave." "Why?" I asked, my throat dry. She hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the newspaper. "They say Margaret never left, that she's waiting for something, or someone." I drove back to the house that evening, determined to pack my things and leave for good. But as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something strange. The porch light was on, even though I hadn't left it that way. And on the front step was a vase of fresh lilies. I should have left then and there, but something compelled me to go inside, to see it through. The smell of lilies was so thick it made my eyes water. The air felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm. I stepped cautiously into the living room, my heart pounding. That's when I saw it. The photograph, now framed and sitting on the mantel. It wasn't where I'd left it, and it wasn't the same photo. This time, the woman wasn't on the porch. She was inside the house, standing in the hallway. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. The photo was changing, moving. The smell of lilies grew stronger, almost suffocating, and I felt a cold hand brush the back of my neck. I ran. I didn't pack. I didn't lock the door. I just ran. I haven't been back to the house since. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the faint scent of lilies in the air. And every time, I wonder if Margaret is still waiting, or if she's finally found what she was looking for. Let's start a new story. Much of it. It was a chilly Thursday morning, and I was walking to work like I always did, half distracted, my mind already on emails and meetings. I noticed him as I crossed the intersection near my office, standing on the opposite corner, staring at the walk signal like he was waiting for it to grant him permission to exist. He wore an old, slightly oversized green jacket with a tattered collar, the kind you'd find at a thrift store and promptly put back. His face was unremarkable, pale, clean-shaven, a little gaunt. When the light changed, I crossed the street and passed him without a second thought. The next day, I saw him again. Same corner, same jacket, same vacant stare. I slowed for a moment, a twinge of unease curling in my chest, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. Cities are full of strangers. People have routines. I kept walking. On the third day, He wasn't at the corner. He was standing in the lobby of my office building. He wasn't doing anything, not talking to anyone, not holding a phone, not even pretending to read one of the crinkled magazines left on the reception counter. Just standing there, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of that green jacket, looking at nothing in particular. I hesitated by the door, feeling the first true flicker of fear. Then he turned his head, slow and deliberate, and locked eyes with me. There was no emotion in his gaze. No curiosity, no recognition. Just the dull weight of a stare that felt like it could flatten me. I hurried to the elevator, keeping my head down, and when the doors closed, I thought I felt him smile. That night, I dreamed of him. In the dream, I was back at the office, alone in the dimly lit lobby. The air felt too thick, like I was breathing through water. I turned toward the elevator and saw him there, standing just a few feet away, his face too pale, his jacket too green. He raised one hand, index finger extended, and pointed at me. When I woke, my bedroom felt cold, as if someone had been standing by the window, watching me. Over the next week, I started seeing him everywhere. On my way to work, in the park near my apartment, standing at the end of my grocery store aisle. He never approached me, never spoke, but his presence was constant and deliberate. And always that same green jacket. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was homeless and wandered the same parts of the city as I did. Maybe he was someone I vaguely knew and my brain was just misfiring, creating paranoia where none existed. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The fear grew sharper every time I spotted him. One day, I was waiting for the subway when I felt a tug on my sleeve. I turned to see an elderly woman standing beside me, her face weathered and kind. "You look pale," she said softly. "Are you all right?" I almost brushed her off, but then I saw her glance over my shoulder. Her expression shifted from concern to something closer to panic. "You need to leave," she whispered urgently. "Get out of here. Don't look back." I froze. "What? Why?" She shook her head, her grip tightening on my arm. "He's watching you. He's marked you. Don't let him follow you home." I whipped around, my heart hammering, and saw him at the far end of the platform. He wasn't staring at me this time. Instead, his head was tilted slightly to the side, like he was listening to something only he could hear. The train screeched into the station, breaking my paralysis. When I turned back to the woman, she was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes, made my skin crawl. I locked the door to my bedroom, shoved a chair under the handle, and lay awake in the dark, clutching my phone like a lifeline. At 3:13 a.m., a text lit up my screen. No number, no sender, just a single message. Open the door. I stared at the screen, every muscle in my body frozen. Then I heard it. 3 soft knocks on the bedroom door. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knocks came again, louder this time, shaking the door in its frame. My phone buzzed again. Another message. I'm waiting. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I grabbed the lamp from my nightstand and hurled it at the door. The crash echoed through the apartment, but the knocking stopped. I sat there in the dark until sunrise, shaking, too terrified to move. When morning finally came, I opened the door to find a single object lying on the floor. A green button, tarnished and worn. It was the kind of button you'd find on an old jacket. I called in sick and started packing my things. I couldn't stay in that apartment or that city any longer. By the afternoon, I was on the highway, driving aimlessly, not sure where I was going, but desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and the man in the green jacket. It's been a week now, and I haven't seen him again. But last night, I found something in my motel room that stopped me cold, a green button sitting on the nightstand next to the lamp. Let's start a new story. Unmarked and plain except for the weight of it. Heavy enough to make my arms strain as I carried it inside, its corners cutting into my palms. No return address, no note. Just a square of cardboard damp from the evening mist. I set it on the kitchen table, staring at it like it might suddenly explain itself. The air in the room felt strange, thicker, almost electric. My cat, Murphy, usually curious about everything, gave it one sniff and bolted into the other room, his tail puffed up like a bottle brush. "Thanks for the help," I muttered, grabbing a knife from the drawer. I slid the blade under the tape and cut slowly, half expecting a spring-loaded snake to pop out. But when I lifted the flaps, all I saw was black. At first, I thought it was empty. Then I realized there was something inside, a single object wrapped in what looked like ancient velvet. The fabric was so worn that it shimmered in places, its fibers almost translucent. I hesitated, the knife still in my hand. Who sends a package with no return address? No explanation. I wasn't expecting anything. No late-night Amazon impulse buys. No birthday surprises from a friend. Just this thing, but curiosity has a way of overriding common sense. I reached in, the velvet crumbling slightly under my touch, and pulled out what felt like a block of cold metal. When I unwrapped it fully, the breath caught in my throat. It was a clock, but not the kind you'd hang on your wall or put on a nightstand. This was intricate, almost alien. The face wasn't round or square, but a chaotic swirl of interlocking brass gears, some moving so slowly you'd almost miss it. Others spun faster, almost too fast to follow. There were no numbers, just jagged, irregular notches along the edge of the dial. At the center, a single obsidian needle quivered, ticking softly, though I couldn't see what powered it. It was beautiful, in a way that made me deeply uneasy. I flipped it over, looking for any kind of marking, but the back was smooth. My fingers brushed over the edges, and I felt something, tiny letters etched into the side. I held it up to the light, squinting to make them out. "Time serves none." What the hell does that mean? I said aloud, my voice sounding too loud in the empty kitchen. The clock gave a faint click like an engine catching, and I nearly dropped it. I stared at it, waiting for something else to happen. But it just sat there, ticking away in that uneven, hypnotic rhythm. That's when the knocking started. 3 sharp raps on the front door. I jumped, the clock slipping from my hands onto the table. My heart was pounding as I stood frozen, staring at the door. It was late. Too late for a neighbor or a package delivery. Murphy let out a low growl from somewhere in the shadows. Another knock, this time louder, more insistent. I crept toward the door, my feet barely making a sound on the hardwood. I didn't turn on the porch light. Something told me I didn't want whoever, or whatever, was out there to know I was home. Slowly, I peeked through the peephole. No one was there. The porch was empty, just the faint outline of the street lamp in the distance and the steady fall of snow. My breath fogged the peephole as I stayed there, waiting, listening. Knock, knock, knock. This time it came from behind me. I spun around, my back pressing hard against the door. The sound had come from the kitchen, where I'd left the clock. The table was empty. The velvet wrap lay crumpled on the floor, but the clock was gone. The space where it had been seemed darker now, like the shadows had thickened into something more solid. I edged toward the kitchen, grabbing the knife from the counter as I passed it. My pulse thundered in my ears. The air felt colder, the silence heavier, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Then I saw it. The clock was back on the table, but it wasn't alone. The needle, which had been quivering aimlessly before, now pointed straight up, trembling violently. And across the surface of the dial, new markings had appeared. They glowed faintly, a deep, sickly green, shifting and rearranging themselves like living organisms. Murphy hissed from the doorway, his fur bristling. He stared at the clock with wide, terrified eyes, then darted out of the room. I wanted to follow him, to grab my coat and leave the house, but I couldn't look away. The clock's gears spun faster, clicking and whirring, filling the room with a sound that was almost like breathing. And then it spoke, not with words exactly, but with a voice that wasn't a voice, a sensation that burrowed into my skull and vibrated through my bones. "You have opened the thread. Now it unravels." What does that mean? I stammered, the knife trembling in my hand. "Who sent you?" The needle spun wildly, the green markings shifting faster and faster. I backed away, my legs hitting the edge of the counter. The air around the clock shimmered, warping like heat waves, and the shadows in the room grew impossibly long. "Time serves none," The voice said again, more insistent this time. It only takes. The needle stopped spinning, locking onto a single point on the dial. A low hum filled the room, and suddenly, the shadows surged forward, swallowing the walls, the floor, the light itself. I felt the cold wrap around me, pulling me down like I was sinking into an ocean of tar. And then nothing. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. The sun streamed through the window, blinding and too bright. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, but then I saw it. The clock sat on my nightstand, silent and still. Its needle pointed directly at me, and etched into the face, where there had been no numbers before, was a single word. Soon. Let's start a new story. I don't know when I first started to notice it. At first, it was a background hum, a sense of something lurking just beneath my consciousness, too faint to name. I told myself it was stress, the way your mind frays at the edges when you work too many hours or sleep too little. But deep down, I knew better. The first real incident happened last month. I was at the supermarket, filling my cart with the same dull rotation of groceries I always bought. Milk, eggs, frozen dinners, enough to get me through another week. I was halfway down the cereal aisle when I saw her. She was standing at the other end, a woman in a pale yellow sundress. There was nothing remarkable about her, but something about the way she stood froze me in place. She wasn't browsing the shelves or checking her phone. She was just staring at me. I looked away, embarrassed, and pretended to study a box of oatmeal. When I glanced back, she was gone. The aisle was empty. I shook it off and finished my shopping, but when I reached the parking lot, I saw her again. She was standing on the sidewalk, watching me load my bags into the car. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes felt wrong, too focused, like she was trying to memorize every detail of my face. I thought about calling out to her, but the words died in my throat. Something about her presence unnerved me in a way I couldn't explain. I got in my car and drove away, gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the sidewalk was empty. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, calm, blank, staring at me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling lingered long after I turned off the lights. The second incident was harder to dismiss. I just gotten home from work, juggling my laptop bag and a takeout container, when I noticed my front door was ajar. My heart jumped. I never left it open. I was meticulous about locking it before I left. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to call the police, before I pushed the door open with my foot. The apartment was silent, the kind of silence that felt deliberate, like someone holding their breath. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I checked every room, opening closets and peering under the bed. Nothing. Still, the feeling stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. That night, I bolted the door and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. The next morning, I found a strand of yellow thread on my kitchen counter. It was short, barely an inch long, but it stood out against the dark granite like a drop of blood on snow. I don't own anything yellow. By the third incident, I knew I wasn't imagining things. I'd been sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone, when a notification popped up. Your device was accessed from another location. My stomach flipped. I hadn't logged into anything recently. I checked the notification, but the details were vague. Just a timestamp and an IP address I didn't recognize. I changed my passwords, ran a security scan, and told myself it was fine. Probably just a phishing attempt. But when I went to bed that night, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a notification. It was a photo. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was a picture of me, sitting on the couch. My phone was in my hand, my face lit by its glow. It was taken from behind, from the corner of the room. I didn't move. I couldn't. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Slowly, I turned my head to look at the corner where the photo had been taken. There was nothing there, just a shadow too dark to belong. I slept with the lights on that night. Over the next few weeks, the feeling grew worse. I started finding more strands of yellow thread around the apartment, on the bathroom sink, tangled in my bedsheets, caught in the hinge of my laptop. My reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed delayed, just for a fraction of a second, like it was struggling to keep up. I started avoiding mirrors altogether, but the paranoia followed me everywhere. At work, I felt eyes on me, though whenever I turned around, no one was there. On the subway, I'd catch glimpses of pale yellow fabric in the crowd, only for it to vanish when I tried to focus on it. The breaking point came last night. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. When I picked it up, the screen was already unlocked, the camera app open. I stared at the display, confused, and that's when I saw it. The reflection of the woman in yellow, standing behind me. I whipped around, but the room was empty. The air was heavy, like it was holding its breath. My phone buzzed again, and this time, it wasn't a photo. It was a text. "Do you see it now?" My hand shook as I typed back. "Who is this?" The reply came instantly. "You." But not yet. I threw the phone across the room and sat there, my chest heaving. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, deeper, as if they were waiting for me to make a mistake. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. When dawn finally came, I found another strand of yellow thread on my pillow. I don't know who or what she is, but I don't think she's just watching anymore. Every time I see her, she feels a little closer, like she's peeling back the layers of me, trying to find something beneath the surface. I don't know what happens when she gets close enough, but I don't think I'll be the one left in this body when she does. Let's start a new story. Endless stretches of highways that connect the country's forgotten corners. You get used to the weirdness out there. The empty diners that shouldn't be open, the radios that tune to stations that don't exist. But nothing prepares you for the night the highway fights back. It started just after midnight on a run through the desert. My rig was loaded with pallets of bottled water, and I had a deadline to make Phoenix by morning. The highway was dead, just me and the occasional tumbleweed. My headlights cut through the blackness, the road stretching out like an unspooling ribbon under the stars. The first sign that something was off came at mile marker 117. I'd driven this route dozens of times, and I knew that marker well. A weathered green sign, half hidden by sand and scrub. But that night, it wasn't there. Instead, there was a different sign, bright and new. Its reflective letters gleamed in the headlights. 117.5. I frowned. Mile markers don't have decimals. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. I reached for my thermos and took a swig of coffee, bitter and lukewarm, and kept driving. 5 minutes later, another sign appeared. 117.75. I let off the gas, my hands tightening on the wheel. The road looked the same, flat, endless, but something about it felt wrong now. The air seemed heavier, pressing against the cab like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. No wind, no clouds. Just an oppressive, suffocating stillness. Then the radio crackled. It wasn't tuned to anything. I always keep it off at night, preferring the quiet. But suddenly, the cab was filled with static, sharp and angry. A voice broke through, faint and warbling, like someone speaking underwater. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, desperate. I reached for the dial to shut it off, but the knob wouldn't turn. The static grew louder, drowning out the voice, until it was all I could hear. I slammed my palm against the radio, and it went silent. That's when I saw the figure. It was standing in the middle of the road, directly in my path. A woman in a long dress, her hair whipping around her face, as if caught in a wind that didn't exist. She didn't move, didn't flinch as my headlights bore down on her. I yanked the wheel to the right, tires screeching as I swerved onto the shoulder. The rig shuddered, threatening to tip, but I managed to keep it upright, coming to a jarring stop in a cloud of dust. My heart was hammering as I jumped out of the cab, flashlight in hand. "Hey," I called, scanning the road. "Are you okay?" The road was empty. I shone the light in every direction, the beam cutting through the dark. Nothing. No woman. No footprints. Not even a hint of disturbed sand where she should have been standing. I was alone. Swallowing hard, I climbed back into the cab and locked the doors. The adrenaline was still surging, but I had to keep moving. I couldn't afford to be late. I started the engine, the low rumble settling my nerves, and eased back onto the highway. The next sign appeared a few miles later. 118. Then another. 118.5. And another. 118.75. The decimals were growing smaller, closer together, as if the highway itself was fracturing, pulling apart piece by piece. I tried the radio again, but it was dead. No static, no voices, just silence. My phone had no signal. The GPS on my dashboard froze. The map flickering before the screen went black. I kept driving. The miles dragged on, each sign marking the descent into something I couldn't explain. The air inside the cab grew colder, frost forming on the edges of the windshield despite the desert heat outside. Shadows moved at the edge of the headlights, too quick and fleeting to be animals. They were shapes human-like but wrong, their limbs too long, their movements jagged and unnatural. At 119.9, I saw the woman again. This time, she was standing on the side of the road, her back to me. Her dress was torn, the fabric fluttering as if caught in a breeze. Her head tilted slightly as I approached, her hair spilling over her shoulder like a curtain. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I passed her in seconds, but in the rearview mirror, she was still there. Closer now, standing in the middle of the road, staring directly at me. Her eyes, God, her eyes, were pits of blackness, swallowing the light, her face pale and blank as porcelain. She raised a hand, her fingers impossibly long and pointed. The engine sputtered, the headlights flickered, and then the rig stalled completely, coasting to a stop at mile marker 120. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my breath fogging in the freezing cab. I didn't dare look in the mirrors. The air felt alive around me, heavy with a presence I couldn't see but knew was there. Something tapped against the window. Slowly, I turned my head. A hand pressed against the glass, slender and white, the fingers too many and too long. The nails scraped softly, rhythmically, as if waiting for me to react. My chest tightened, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The hand slid away, leaving streaks of frost. And then, from the shadows beyond the windshield, the woman emerged. She wasn't walking. She was gliding, her bare feet hovering inches above the ground, her body unnaturally still as she moved. Her mouth opened, a black void, and the voice I'd heard on the radio poured out, a garbled, guttural cry. I slammed the accelerator. The engine roared to life, and the rig lurched forward, tires spitting gravel as I tore down the highway. I didn't look back. The sign stopped appearing after that. The decimals, the numbers, all of it gone. The highway stretched on, unmarked, endless, until the faint glow of dawn began to break over the horizon. When I finally reached Phoenix, I parked at the depot and sat in the cab for a long time, staring at my hands. They were shaking. I told myself it was just a bad night, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But when I climbed down, I noticed something. There were scratches on the passenger side window. Long, jagged lines, as if something or something. Let's start a new story. One morning, as I stumbled into the kitchen half asleep, I noticed all four of my dining chairs pulled away from the table, perfectly equidistant, as though an invisible dinner party had just concluded. I froze, rubbing my eyes. I was meticulous about pushing them in, one of those obsessive habits I'd had since childhood. Still, I convinced myself I must have forgotten the night before. A lapse in memory. It happens. The next morning, it happened again. This time, the chairs weren't just pulled out. They were turned, each one angled toward a different corner of the room. The sight unsettled me in a way I couldn't articulate, like seeing someone else's fingerprints on your reflection. I checked the locks on the front door and windows twice that day, just to be sure. Everything was secure. By the third morning, the chairs were on the table, balanced precariously on their back legs, as if staged by someone trying to mock me. I felt that same tight knot of unease in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone. What would I say? That I was being terrorized by furniture? It sounded absurd. I put the chairs back, went to work, and pretended nothing was wrong. Then it spread to other things. I'd wake up to find the salt and pepper shakers on opposite sides of the counter, like tiny sentinels standing guard. My toothbrush appeared on the living room coffee table, wet though I hadn't used it. Once, I found every book on my shelf turned backward, spines facing the wall. The methodical care of it made my stomach turn. It wasn't just movement either. Objects started vanishing. At first, it was small things, a pair of socks, my phone charger, a spoon. Then it escalated. My favorite coat disappeared from its hook by the door. A framed picture of my parents was gone from the mantel. What terrified me most wasn't that these things were missing, but that I never found them. Not in the trash. Not in the attic. They were just gone. I tried staying awake all night to catch whoever, or whatever, was behind it. But nothing ever happened while I was watching. Exhaustion wore me down. After a week of this, I convinced myself it had to be some bizarre prank or even sleepwalking. Maybe I was the one moving things without realizing it. The alternative was too horrifying to consider. The night everything changed, I'd fallen asleep on the couch with the TV still on. It was late, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, when a loud crash jolted me awake. The sound came from the kitchen. My heart pounding, I grabbed my phone for light and crept toward the noise. The kitchen was trashed. Every drawer was yanked open, their contents spilled onto the floor. Plates lay shattered, utensils scattered. And in the center of it all, perfectly upright on the tile, stood one of the dining chairs. The thing was, I knew I'd been alone. There was no time for anyone to break in, much less destroy my kitchen and leave without a sound. The realization left me trembling. I backed away, tripping over a spoon, and nearly fell when I saw the walls. Words, scrawled everywhere in what looked like black soot, looping and jagged. I can't find it. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Instead, I cleaned the kitchen, scrubbed the walls, and piled the chairs in the hallway closet, locking the door tight. Whatever this was, it wouldn't stop. The next day, I bought cameras. 3 of them. I set one in the living room, one in the kitchen, and one aimed at my bedroom door. I didn't tell anyone. I wasn't ready to explain the madness that had taken over my life. All I wanted was proof. Or maybe reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind. The first 2 nights, the footage showed nothing but an empty apartment. No movement, no disturbances, nothing unusual. I started to feel a cautious relief, thinking maybe it was over. The 3rd night proved me wrong. When I checked the footage the next morning, I found something on the living room camera. Around 3:12 a.m., the screen went fuzzy, the image distorting for a full 30 seconds before clearing. And there in the center of the frame was one of my dining chairs, not walking or floating, just there, as though it had appeared in the blink of an eye. A shadow moved across the corner of the screen, low to the ground, its shape impossible to define. It didn't look like a person. It didn't look like anything I could describe. And then the feed cut out. I tried to tell myself it was a glitch, but the claw marks in the closet door said otherwise. For deep gouges, raking across the wood from top to bottom, as if something had tried to rip it open. When I unlocked it, the chairs were gone. The final straw came a week later. I woke up to find my bed had been moved, not just an inch or 2, but all the way across the room, as though someone or something had dragged it while I was asleep. I bolted upright, disoriented and sick with fear, and realized I wasn't alone. There was something in the corner, a figure, hunched and angular, its limbs too long and its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It was holding something, a single chair balanced delicately in its claw-like hands. Its head turned slowly, too slowly, until it was looking directly at me. Or maybe through me. Its face, if you could call it that, was blank. No eyes, no mouth, just a faint impression of features that might have been long ago. It raised the chair almost like an offering. Then it whispered, in a voice so faint it barely reached my ears. "Help me remember." I screamed. I don't remember much after that, just running, slamming doors, and collapsing in the stairwell of my apartment building. When I finally dared to go back, I didn't step inside. I just grabbed what I could from the doorway and left. I've moved twice since then, and I've thrown out every chair I own. I sit on the floor now. It's stupid, I know, but every time I see a chair, I can't help but feel like it's watching me, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. Because whatever it was, it's still looking for something, and I don't think it's finished with me yet. Let's start a new story. It started with the streetlights. Not that they were out or flickering. That's mundane. Instead, they were blinking in patterns, an odd Morse code that no one else seemed to notice. I first saw it on a late-night walk after a long day. The glow of the lights pulsed, pausing just enough to make me stop and stare. Blink, blink, blink. Pause. Blink, blink, blink. It didn't feel random. It felt deliberate. Malfunction. I muttered to myself and moved on. But when I glanced back, the lights were steady again, warm orbs lighting the empty street like always. It was probably nothing. Probably. The next morning, it was the clock on my microwave. It read 6:31 a.m., even though I'd woken up at 8 o'clock. My phone said 8:02. My alarm clock on the nightstand said 8:03. Just the microwave stubbornly fixed in its own reality. I reset it. Easy fix. Except that night, when I went to heat up some leftovers, it was 6:31 again. Same numbers, same smug, glowing defiance. I laughed nervously, unplugged it, and plugged it back in. The time blinked 12 o'clock for a moment, as expected. Then it flicked straight to 6:31, like it had been waiting for me. I stopped using the microwave after that. It wasn't just the appliances. Days felt skewed. I'd have vivid memories of saying things I hadn't yet said, places I hadn't yet gone. Once, I picked up my phone to reply to a text from my friend Derek, only to see the message already answered. My words stared back at me. Sure, 7 works fine, but I hadn't sent it. Worse, when I met Derek at 7 that night, he laughed like nothing was wrong. Man, you really wanted tonight to happen, he said, grinning. You texted me about it twice. I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. But my phone disagreed, the messages stamped with times I didn't remember writing. Small glitches here and there, until they weren't small anymore. A few weeks later, I woke up in a version of my bedroom that wasn't quite mine. Everything was in the right place. Same bed, same dresser, same faded poster of that band I hadn't liked in years, but the air felt wrong. Heavy. I noticed small differences immediately. The closet door, which always squeaked, slid open silently. My nightstand lamp had a new pattern etched into its base, a swirling vine design that I didn't remember buying. Even the sunlight streaming through the blinds felt sharper, almost clinical. When I stepped into the hallway, my breath hitched. The hallway wasn't mine. The walls were blank and pale, with no sign of the cluttered photos I'd hung there. At the end of the hall, a single door stood ajar, revealing a room I'd never seen before. It wasn't a dream. I knew that much. I felt too awake, too there. My feet moved toward the door before I could stop them, the hinges creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, there was nothing. Not empty space, but literal nothingness. A gaping void, black and infinite, humming softly as though it were alive. I stood on the threshold, trembling, when something inside the darkness moved. Just a flicker, a suggestion of motion, impossible to pin down. I slammed the door shut and stumbled back, heart racing. The hallway returned to normal in a blink, my photos reappearing on the walls like they'd never left. The closet squeaked again when I threw it open, and the lamp on my nightstand was plain metal. No vines in sight. I told myself it was stress, overwork, maybe even a sleepwalking episode. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted permanently, like I'd slipped between cracks in the floorboards of my life. The cracks widened. One day, I walked into my favorite coffee shop to find the barista calling me by the wrong name. "Hey, Alex," she chirped. "My name isn't Alex." I corrected her, but she only gave me a puzzled look. "Oh, sorry," she said, though she didn't sound sorry at all. When my order came, it was for Alex again. The receipt read double latte Alex. I almost laughed. Almost. Except when I sat down and looked at the receipt, the name had changed. Nate. My real name. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. From there, the changes were constant. I'd leave work only to find my building's exterior a different color. My route home twisted in impossible ways. A familiar intersection would suddenly open onto a street I'd never seen before. People began acting strange. Too kind. Too attentive. "We're glad you're still here," the cashier at the grocery store whispered one night as she handed me my receipt. I hadn't said a word to her. "Still here? Still where?" Then came the whispers. Low, distant murmurs that seemed to follow me everywhere. I couldn't make out the words, but they filled the edges of my days, just beneath the hum of the fluorescent lights at work or the quiet of my apartment at night. I'd catch snatches of voices behind closed doors, only to open them and find empty rooms. One evening, I woke up from a restless nap and found myself staring at my own reflection. But it wasn't in a mirror. It was standing across the room, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, wearing my face, but with a blank, neutral expression. "You're slipping," it said, its voice perfectly calm, perfectly mine. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It walked toward me, each step deliberate, and crouched down to meet my wide-eyed gaze. "Do you even know which version of you this is?" it asked. I opened my mouth to reply, but no sound came out. It smiled faintly and stood again, walking to the door. Before it left, it looked over its shoulder. "You're not supposed to notice. That's the rule." And then it was gone. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the spot where it had been. Hours, maybe days? Time felt irrelevant now. My apartment was normal again by morning, though normal felt like an illusion. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked hesitant, uncertain, as if waiting for me to say something. This afternoon, I found a note on my kitchen counter, scrawled in handwriting that looked like mine, but wasn't. It read, "You're almost out of time. Decide. Stay or let go. I don't know what happens if I choose wrong. Maybe I already have." Let's start a new story. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind where time feels sticky and everything moves just a little too slowly. I was carrying groceries, eggs, bread, a bottle of wine, and humming some half-forgotten tune when the elevator lurched. Not an unusual lurch, just that small jolt as it passed the 4th floor on its way to the 6th. It always did that, but then it happened again. The same lurch, the same floor. I glanced at the panel, expecting it to show 5, but it still read 4. My reflection in the brushed metal walls looked as confused as I felt. Then, just as quickly as it had stopped, the elevator resumed its climb, doors sliding open with a cheerful ding. I stepped out into the hallway, laughing nervously to myself. "Old building," I muttered, balancing the groceries as I fished for my keys. My apartment looked the same as I'd left it. The curtains were drawn halfway, letting in a slant of golden light. A magazine I'd been thumbing through lay open on the couch, and a faint, pleasant smell of lavender lingered from the candle I'd blown out earlier. Comforting. Normal. Except the wine bottle. I didn't remember buying 2. It was sitting on the counter next to the cutting board, identical to the one I just unpacked from the bag. Same label, same tiny nick in the foil at the top. My heart skipped. Had I bought one last week and forgotten about it? That wasn't like me. I wasn't the type to let alcohol go unnoticed in the house. I chalked it up to bad memory and shoved it into the fridge. Out of sight, out of mind. The next day, things got stranger. I woke up to find my phone blinking with a notification. 8 missed calls, all from unknown. I swiped them away, annoyed, and went about my morning routine. Coffee, shower, scroll mindlessly through emails. But as I poured cereal into my bowl, a faint ringing started up again. The sound wasn't coming from my phone, it was coming from the fridge. I froze, the box of cereal suspended midair. Who keeps a phone in their fridge? I set the cereal down and approached cautiously, like the appliance might lunge at me. When I opened the door, the sound stopped. Everything inside was just as I'd left it. The milk, the eggs, the duplicate wine bottle. No phone. I slammed the fridge shut and took a deep breath. Stress. It's just stress. Maybe I'd been working too hard, skipping too much sleep. That had to be it. But the ringing started again that afternoon, this time from my bathroom mirror. It wasn't loud, more like the hum of an old landline vibrating against glass. When I leaned in close, I thought I saw a movement beneath the surface of the mirror, like a second reflection, just a fraction of a second out of sync. My stomach churned, but I reached out and pressed my fingers to the glass. It was warm. That was when I decided to leave the apartment. I threw on a jacket and walked aimlessly for what felt like hours, zigzagging through the city streets, trying to lose myself in the comforting hum of urban life. The crowd, the noise, The endless movement, it grounded me. For a while anyway, until I saw myself. Not a reflection, not some illusion in a shop window, but me, standing at a bus stop on the corner of Harrow and 8th. I was wearing the same jacket, the same scuffed sneakers. I were holding a takeout coffee cup and scrolling through a phone. The same phone I'd left behind at the apartment. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The other me didn't notice. They looked up when the bus arrived, calmly stepped on, and disappeared behind tinted glass. I didn't follow. I couldn't. That night, I locked every door and window in my apartment. I tried not to look at the mirrors. I left the fridge unplugged just in case. But no matter how tightly I bundled myself into the corner of my couch, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate padding across the hardwood floor. They stopped just outside the bedroom. I didn't dare move. My body was paralyzed with fear, the kind that floods your veins with cold. Then, I heard the door creak open. The light from the hallway spilled in, and for a moment, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I saw them. It wasn't me this time, not exactly. The figure in the doorway looked close enough to be his sibling. Same height, same build, even the same scar along their jawline. But their face was wrong. Too smooth, too perfect, like a mannequin skin stretched over my features. "Why are you here?" I managed to choke out. They tilted their head, a gesture so eerily familiar it sent shivers down my spine. "Why are you?" Their voice sounded distant, as though it came from underwater. I don't remember what happened next. My memory goes blank after that. When I woke up, the sun was shining, the apartment was empty, and everything was back in its place. Even the wine bottle, just one this time. But the reflection in the bathroom mirror, it doesn't blink when I do. Let's start a new story. It wasn't, but because of what happened after I bought it. It was a rainy Saturday when I found it at a flea market on the edge of town. I hadn't planned on buying anything, just wandering to kill time, but the mirror caught my eye. It was propped up against a table cluttered with vintage knickknacks, its tarnished brass frame worn, but still beautiful. The surface was foggy, with faint scratches crisscrossing its face, but I could see enough of my reflection to tell it was just the right size for the entryway of my new apartment. "How much?" I asked the vendor, an older woman bundled in a long coat, her gray hair tucked into a scarf. She looked at me for a moment, her expression unreadable, before naming a price that was absurdly low. "You sure?" I asked, thinking I must have misheard. "Take it," she said, almost impatiently. "It's yours now." If I hadn't been in such a rush to get out of the rain, maybe I'd have noticed the way she avoided looking directly at the mirror. Maybe I'd have noticed her quick glance at the cloudy sky, or the way her hands trembled slightly as she handed me my change. But I didn't. I carried the mirror to my car and drove home, already imagining how it would brighten up the narrow hallway outside my living room. That night, after mounting it on the wall, I stood back to admire my handiwork. The mirror was old and imperfect, but it gave the space a kind of charm that modern furniture couldn't replicate. I liked it, but then I noticed something strange. In the reflection, the hallway behind me seemed wrong. At first, I couldn't figure out why. The furniture was all there. The bookshelf, the small potted plant by the door, but the light fell off, dimmer than it should have been. The shadows were too sharp, too deep. It gave the whole scene a flat, almost two-dimensional quality, like a photograph taken under bad lighting. I turned around, glancing at the hallway itself. Nothing out of the ordinary. When I looked back at the mirror, though, I could swear the reflection wasn't quite the same. The shadows seemed to shift, subtly but noticeably, as though they were reacting to something just out of frame. I shook my head, chalking it up to the oddities of old glass, and went to bed. The next morning, the feeling of unease lingered. Every time I walked past the mirror, I felt compelled to glance at it, as though it was daring me to catch it in the act of doing something. But it was always still, always reflecting the same warped image of my hallway. That night, as I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone, I heard something that made my skin crawl, a soft, almost imperceptible creak, like the sound of weight shifting on an old wooden floor. My apartment was silent otherwise, the kind of silence that amplifies every noise. I froze, holding my breath, waiting for it to happen again. When it didn't, I forced myself to relax, laughing at my own paranoia. Probably the building settling, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. But as I passed the mirror on my way to bed, I stopped dead. The hallway in the reflection was empty, but something was wrong. The shadows had grown darker, almost liquid, pooling unnaturally around the corners of the frame. And there was something else, just barely visible at the edge of the glass. A shape, human-like but indistinct, as though it were leaning just out of sight. I turned around quickly, heart pounding, but the hallway behind me was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the shape was gone. For the next few days, I tried to avoid the mirror as much as possible, but it felt impossible. Every time I walked by it, I felt its pull like an itch I couldn't scratch. I started catching glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, fleeting and almost imperceptible, but enough to make my stomach twist. At night, I heard soft creaks and faint whispers, sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. One evening, I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed a blanket and threw it over the mirror, covering it completely. The relief was immediate. Without the mirror's presence, the apartment felt lighter, less oppressive. I slept soundly for the first time in days. But when I woke the next morning, the blanket was on the floor. The mirror was uncovered. I stared at it, my pulse hammering in my ears. The reflection was normal at first glance, but as I stepped closer, I saw it. The shape again, clearer this time. It was standing at the far end of the hallway, just barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't make out any features, but I felt its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. My breath hitched as I turned, half expecting to see it behind me. There was nothing there, just the empty hallway. I should have gotten rid of the mirror right then, but something stopped me. Fear, maybe, or curiosity. Instead, I called a friend, someone I trusted, someone who wouldn't think I was crazy. When she arrived, I didn't explain much, just pointed at the mirror and said, "Tell me what you see." She stood in front of it for a long moment, her brow furrowing. "It's just your hallway," she said finally. "Why? You don't see anything else?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head. "Should I?" I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. If she couldn't see it, then maybe it wasn't the mirror. Maybe it was me. That night, I dreamed of the hallway. It stretched out endlessly, its walls narrowing as it receded into darkness. The shape was there, closer now, its outline sharper. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, as it reached out a hand toward me, its fingers impossibly long and thin. When I woke up, the air in my room felt heavy, suffocating. The mirror was waiting, its surface gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The next morning, I took the mirror down and drove it back to the flea market. The old woman was there, sitting at her stall as though she'd been expecting me. When she saw the mirror in my hands, she shook her head. "You can't bring it back," she said simply. "What do you mean? Take it," I pleaded. "I don't want it anymore." She gave me a sad, almost pitying smile. "It's yours now," she said. "It won't let you leave it behind." I left it there anyway, propped against the edge of her table, and drove home, trying to convince myself it was over. But when I opened the door to my apartment, it was waiting for me. The mirror, leaning against the wall, exactly where it had been before. I don't look into it anymore. I can feel the shape getting closer, and I know that someday it will step out. Let's start a new story. There was no mail delivery on Sundays, and yet there it was sitting on my kitchen table when I came downstairs. No stamp, no return address. Just my name, Caroline, written in elegant cursive on the front. I froze, coffee mug halfway to my lips. I lived alone. The doors had been locked, the windows shut tight. Yet, somehow this thing was here. My first thought was that it was a prank. Maybe a friend with a spare key trying to mess with me. But the more I stared at the envelope, the more an unsettling feeling crawled up my spine. The paper was thick and heavy, like the kind people used to write with centuries ago, and the handwriting felt too deliberate, too precise. I almost didn't open it. Something about it screamed don't. But curiosity, or something deeper, won out. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly into thirds. Written in the same delicate script were 5 words. "You forgot the other side." I flipped the paper over. It was blank. For a moment, I just stared at it, trying to make sense of the message. The other side of what? The paper? My life? Was this a metaphor? I crumpled it and tossed it in the trash, irritated at whoever had decided to play mind games with me. But for the rest of the day, the words gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. By the time I went to bed, I had convinced myself it was a meaningless prank, nothing more. That night, I dreamed of mirrors. I was standing in my bedroom, but it wasn't quite right. The furniture was the same, the walls the same pale blue, but everything was reversed, like I was looking at a reflection. In front of me was a full-length mirror that I didn't own, its ornate frame made of dark, twisting metal. I stepped closer, and my reflection did the same. But something was off. It wasn't me. Not exactly. The reflection smiled when I didn't, tilted its head when mine stayed still. Its eyes were mine, but sharper somehow, glinting like the edge of a blade. And then it spoke. "You forgot the other side," it whispered, the voice soft but chilling. I woke up gasping, my heart pounding. The room was dark, the air thick with an unfamiliar weight. I told myself it was just a nightmare, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I got up to grab some water, the envelope was back, sitting on the kitchen table, perfectly placed as though it had never been moved. I froze. My trash was still sealed, the crumpled paper exactly where I'd thrown it. But here was the envelope, pristine and mocking. This time, I didn't open it. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door, needing air, needing space, needing to feel like I was in control of something. But as I drove through the empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows felt darker than usual, stretching unnaturally long under the streetlights. At every red light, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something sitting in the back seat. When I got home, exhausted and more than a little shaken, the envelope was gone. The next few days passed uneventfully. No letters, no nightmares. I started to believe that whatever had happened was over, that my mind had been playing tricks on me. Until I found the mirror. I was cleaning out the attic, a chore I'd put off for months, when I saw it leaning against the far wall. A full-length mirror, its frame a tangle of dark metal vines that seemed to writhe when the light hit them just right. I'd never seen it before. I should have left it there. Every instinct I had screamed to leave it alone, to shut the attic door and never open it again. But I didn't. Instead, I dragged it downstairs and set it up in the living room. The moment it was in place, the air in the room shifted. It was subtle, just a whisper of something too faint to name, but I felt it in my chest. For hours, I avoided looking directly at the mirror. Every time I passed it, I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look, it was just my reflection. That night, the dreams came back. This time, I was in a house that looked like mine, but wasn't. The walls were too tall, the windows too narrow, and the light that filtered in was a sickly, unnatural yellow. I stood in front of the mirror again, my reflection watching me with that same unnerving smile. "Do you want to see it?" it asked. "See what?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "The other side," it said, reaching a hand toward the glass. I wanted to back away, to run, but my feet were rooted to the floor. My reflection's hand pressed against the surface, and to my horror, the glass rippled like water. "Let me show you," it said, stepping through the mirror. I woke up screaming, the sound echoing through the empty house. When I stumbled into the living room, the mirror was cracked, a jagged line splitting the glass down the middle. But it wasn't the reflection that froze me in place. It was the handprint on the inside of the glass, dark and smeared, as though someone had pressed their palm against it from the other side. I didn't sleep for days after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the pull of the mirror, the weight of its presence pressing against my mind. Then one night, the envelope appeared again. This time, the message was different. "It's already here. I don't know what it means, but when I look in the mirror now, my reflection doesn't always move the way it's supposed to." Let's start a new story. It was late, and the rain had been pounding against the windows all evening. The apartment building wasn't exactly state-of-the-art, and the occasional flicker wasn't unusual. I barely even noticed it, too engrossed in my freelance editing job to care. Deadlines don't wait for bad weather. But when the second flicker came, it lasted longer, long enough for the laptop screen to go black and my reflection to stare back at me. The room was silent except for the hum of the fridge. That's when I heard the knock. It wasn't at the front door. It was soft, deliberate, coming from the wall. The inside wall. I froze. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, and the wall the sound came from didn't share with the hallway or a neighbor. On the other side was just nothing. The knock came again, a steady 3 taps. My stomach clenched. I stood, feeling absurdly brave for the moment, and pressed my ear to the wall. I didn't hear anything at first, but as I strained to listen, there was a faint scratching, like fingernails on drywall. I backed away quickly, grabbing my phone and pretending to scroll as if the presence of technology could ward off irrational fear. After a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it was nothing, probably mice in the walls, or maybe something loose from the storm. I went back to my desk, even though my heart wouldn't quite settle. At 3:14 a.m., the power went out completely. My laptop died, plunging the room into darkness save for the faint glow of the streetlights through the blinds. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight, and that's when I saw it. There was a crack in the wall. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. It ran vertically, jagged and narrow, just above the baseboard. Something about it made my skin crawl. It was too perfect, too clean, as if it had been deliberately carved. Then, from the crack, I heard breathing. It wasn't loud. It was shallow, uneven, the kind of sound you'd make after running uphill in the cold. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out of the apartment, but instead, I crouched down and moved closer to the crack, shining my flashlight at it. "Hello!" My voice barely broke the air, trembling as much as my hands. The breathing stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, something slid out from the crack. It was small and metallic, reflecting the flashlight's beam. My heart thudded as I realized it was an old key, tarnished and worn. It clattered to the floor and lay there, still and accusing. I didn't touch it. By morning, the crack was gone. The wall was smooth again, unmarked, as if the events of the night before had been some fever dream. But the key was still on the floor, undeniable proof that something had happened. I picked it up with a tissue, studying it like it might burn me. It wasn't remarkable, just an ordinary old key, but the weight of it in my hand felt wrong, like it didn't belong here. That day, I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept wandering back to the key. What door did it open? Why had it been in my wall? The questions buzzed around my head, refusing to settle. That night, I locked the key in a drawer and told myself to forget about it. But the knocking came back. It was louder this time, more insistent. 3 knocks, then silence. 3 more, then silence again. I ignored it, pulling the blanket over my head like a child, but it wouldn't stop. Finally, I snapped. I leapt out of bed, yanked open the drawer, and grabbed the key. The knocking stopped immediately. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I nearly screamed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Call me downstairs." I didn't respond. I didn't move. A moment later, another text came through. "Bring the key." I should have called someone, anyone, but a strange compulsion took hold of me. My hands were shaking as I pulled on my jacket and grabbed my phone. I told myself I'd just go to the lobby, see if anyone was there. If it was a prank, I'd report it to the landlord. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a prank. The lobby was empty. The front doors were locked, the only sound the faint buzz of the emergency lights. My phone buzzed again. Basement. I didn't want to go. Every instinct screamed against it, but my feet moved anyway. The stairwell down to the basement smelled damp and metallic, the air heavy with the scent of rust. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting warped shadows on the walls. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement stretched out before me, cold, dark, lined with storage units for the tenants. I hesitated, shining my flashlight around the space, but it barely pierced the gloom. And then I saw it, a A single door at the far end of the basement, made of dark wood with a tarnished metal lock. I'd never noticed it before, and I'd been down here plenty of times to grab boxes. It shouldn't have been there. The key grew heavy in my pocket, almost burning through the fabric. As I approached, the air grew colder, every breath hanging in front of me in a ghostly fog. The door didn't have a knob, just a keyhole that seemed to gleam in the darkness, waiting. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something else, something I couldn't name, but I pulled out the key, slid it into the lock, and turned. The door creaked open. The room beyond wasn't a room. It was a tunnel, impossibly long and dark, stretching into nothingness. The air inside felt alive, vibrating with a low hum that I could feel in my teeth. And at the far end of the tunnel, barely visible, was a figure. It was standing perfectly still, its outline sharp and wrong like a tear in reality. As I stared, it began to move, not walking, but gliding toward me with an unnatural speed. I slammed the door shut and ran. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. By the time the landlord came to fix my heater a week later, the basement door was gone. The wall where it had been was smooth, as if it had never existed. But the key was still in my pocket, and at night, when the apartment is quiet and the lights flicker, I hear knocking. It's louder now, and it's coming from inside the drawer. Let's start a new story. When the message arrived, it wasn't in my inbox. It wasn't on my phone either. It wasn't anywhere that made sense. It was on my bedroom ceiling. I woke up to a faint scratching sound. At first, I thought it was the tree outside, its bare branches clawing against the window. But the noise was coming from above. Groggy, I rubbed my eyes and stared up into the dim light filtering through the blinds. "Who are you?" The words were scrawled across the ceiling in jagged, uneven letters, like they'd been scratched into the plaster with something sharp. I bolted upright, heart pounding. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but the door was locked, the windows sealed. I didn't own a ladder, and the ceiling was too high for anyone to reach without one. I tried to think rationally. Maybe I'd been sleepwalking. Maybe I'd done it myself. But how? I didn't own anything sharp enough to gouge plaster like that. And even if I had, why would I write something so cryptic, so alien? I grabbed a flashlight and shone it across the words, hoping it was some kind of illusion, a trick of the light. It wasn't. The letters were deep, their edges rough and splintered. Tiny flakes of plaster, dust scattered onto my bed as I stared. By morning, the words were gone. At first, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing, but when I touched the ceiling, the gouges were still there. Smooth plaster was replaced with rough scars, invisible unless you knew where to look. That was the beginning. The next message appeared 3 days later, this time on my bathroom mirror. "What did you do?" It wasn't written in the foggy residue left after a shower or smeared in lipstick. It was carved into the glass, the edges glinting sharp under the fluorescent light. I stood frozen, toothbrush hanging limp in my hand. I didn't even dare to reach out and touch the words. They felt alive somehow, like they were waiting for me to acknowledge them. I stared at my reflection. My face stared back, pale and tight with fear. But there was something else. A flicker, movement, just beneath the surface of the glass. I leaned closer, breath fogging the mirror. For a split second, I swore my reflection smiled. I did not. I left the bathroom light on that night. The third message appeared in my notebook at work. I was in the middle of a meeting, scribbling down notes, when I turned the page and saw the words. "Do you remember?" I froze, pen hovering above the paper. The letters weren't in my handwriting. They were jagged, chaotic, almost frantic. The ink was darker than my pen, the lines bolder, as if they'd been pressed into the page with violent force. "Something wrong?" my coworker asked, glancing at me. I quickly flipped the notebook shut and shook my head. "No, just tired." I wanted to throw the notebook away, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. When I got home, I opened it again. The message was gone. The pages were blank. That night, the dream started. They weren't dreams, exactly. They felt too sharp, too vivid, like memories I'd forgotten but shouldn't have. I was in a field, endless and flat. The sky above me choked with storm clouds. There was something out there, something massive. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. It moved, slow and deliberate, the ground shaking beneath my feet with every step. I tried to run, but the field stretched on forever, and the thing kept getting closer. Just before it reached me, I woke up, gasping for air. I told myself it was stress, lack of sleep, too many hours spent staring at a screen. But deep down, I knew better. The messages became more frequent. They showed up in places they had no business being. A piece of mail delivered to my apartment that read, "Where did you hide it?" in blocky, typewritten letters. A billboard on my drive to work that said, "You lied." A text on my phone, sent from my own number, that simply said, "You can't run." I stopped sleeping altogether. The field for my dreams started creeping into my waking hours. I'd catch glimpses of it in reflections, in the corner of my bathroom mirror, in the black void of my turned-off TV. Once, while washing dishes, I looked down at the soapy water and saw the endless stretch of grass staring back at me. The thing in the field was closer now. I could hear it breathing, low and rhythmic, like thunder rolling over the horizon. I don't know what it wants. I don't even know what I've done. The messages keep asking questions I can't answer, demanding things I don't understand. Last night, I woke up standing in my backyard. I was barefoot, wearing only my pajamas, my skin prickling from the cold. In my hand was a knife I didn't recognize, the blade smeared with dirt. I looked down and saw a hole. I dug it myself. It was shallow, more of a scrape than a hole, but the knife felt heavy in my hand, like I'd been digging for hours. This morning, I found another message. It was waiting for me on the ceiling again, but this time the letters were enormous, stretching from wall to wall, impossible to ignore. It's almost here. I don't know what it is. I don't want to find out. But when I look in the mirror now, I see the field behind me. And just over my shoulder, I see something moving. It's closer than ever. Let's start a new story. The way the sky glowed that night should have been my first warning. It wasn't the comforting dark blue of a typical evening, but a deep, otherworldly red, like the horizon itself was bleeding. I'd seen sunsets before, sure, but not like this. No stars, no moon, just a strange, pulsating crimson, as if the atmosphere were alive. I'd been working late at the bar that night, and by the time I stepped outside, my phone said it was almost 2 a.m. I decided to walk home. It was only a 10-minute trip through quiet residential streets, and the cold air felt good after hours under buzzing fluorescent lights. The neighborhood was one of those older suburbs where every house had character. Old picket fences leaning to one side, peeling paint on shutters, and yards overtaken by frostbitten grass. I liked it usually, but that night, the houses felt too still, too dark, like they were holding their breath. The first thing that tipped me off was the absence of sound. No rustle of leaves, no distant hum of traffic, not even the soft chitter of animals. Just silence, so thick it felt like cotton stuffed in my ears. Even my footsteps seemed muted. I told myself it was nothing. Late-night walks were always eerie if you let your imagination run wild. Then I saw the cat. It was perched on the hood of a rusted-out car under a dim street lamp, its fur patchy and its eyes a sickly yellow. But it wasn't just sitting. It was staring unblinking straight at me. Its mouth opened in a wide yawn, but no sound came out. Not a hiss, not a meow, nothing. I stopped walking, locking eyes with it, my breath misting in the freezing air. The cat tilted its head in that uncanny way cats do, almost like it was mimicking a human gesture. I took a step forward, and the cat leapt off the car, disappearing into the shadows. I laughed nervously, shaking my head at myself. "Get a grip," I muttered. But as I kept walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Not someone, something. It started subtly, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a faint rustling behind me, gone as soon as I turned my head. The prickling sensation of being watched. I sped up, the rhythm of my boots echoing on the pavement. My shadow stretched out long and thin in the red-tinged light. I checked my phone to distract myself, but the screen showed no signal. The battery bar dropped from 40% to 10% in a blink, then died completely. That was when I saw the woman. She was standing under the next street lamp, facing me, her body unnaturally rigid. She wasn't wearing a coat, just a thin white dress that fluttered slightly, though there was no wind. Her hair hung limply around her face, obscuring her features. I stopped walking. She didn't move. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaky. "You okay?" Nothing. No response, no shift in posture, no acknowledgement that I was even there. Just her silhouette, framed in the harsh glow of the flickering light. I hesitated, my instincts warring with my sense of decency. What if she needed help? What if she was hurt? I took a step forward. That's when her head snapped up. It didn't tilt slowly or naturally like someone waking from a daze. It snapped, jerking upwards so fast it made me flinch. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, they weren't right. Too wide, too dark like bottomless pits. And her smile, God, her smile, was too big for her face, stretching unnaturally from cheek to cheek, showing teeth that looked too sharp. I froze, my stomach plummeting into free fall. The woman didn't move, didn't blink. Her smile stayed fixed like it was painted on. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. Then she moved, not toward me, but closer to the edge of the light, like she was retreating into the shadows. But her smile stayed in place, like it was floating in the dark. I didn't wait to see what she'd do next. I turned and bolted, sprinting down the street, the cold air burning in my throat. My boots slipped on patches of ice, but I didn't dare slow down. I just kept running, past house after house with their dark, lifeless windows. My only thought was to get home, lock the door, and pretend this night never happened. But the faster I ran, the longer the street seemed to stretch. The houses blurred together, repeating in an endless loop. A blue house with a broken mailbox, a red one with a cracked window, a white one with a swing set in the yard. Again and again, my chest heaved as panic clawed at me. I wasn't getting anywhere. And then I heard it. Laughter. It wasn't loud. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. A soft, girlish giggle that sent ice down my spine. It wasn't coming from behind me. It was ahead, around me, everywhere. I skidded to a stop, spinning in place, my breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. The street was empty. The shadows were too thick, the red glow of the sky bleeding into the horizon. And the laughter kept growing, louder now, closer, until it sounded like it was right beside me. "Do you want to play?" The voice was a whisper, but it cut through the night like a blade. I whipped around, but there was no one there. Just empty space, the wind finally starting to howl. I ran. I don't know how, but I did. My legs felt heavy like wading through mud, and my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I finally reached my house, the chipped paint on the front door a welcome sight. I fumbled with my keys, tears blurring my vision, and threw myself inside. The first thing I did was lock every door and window. Then I grabbed my phone charger, plugged it in, and waited. The signal came back after a few minutes, the battery ticking up slowly. I didn't call anyone. I didn't know what to say. Instead, I sat by the window, staring out at the street, watching for something. It's been weeks now. I haven't seen her again, haven't heard the laughter. But every night, as I lie in bed, I feel the same prickling sensation, like I'm being watched. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see her smile. Let's start a new story. Staring out the window as the morning sunlight filled my tiny apartment. The weather had been unremarkable all week, just endless blue skies and mild breezes. Today looked the same, until it didn't. The change was subtle at first. I noticed the color of the sky deepening, shifting from its usual pale blue to a shade of cobalt that seemed impossibly rich. I leaned closer to the window, wondering if it was some trick of the light. But then I realized it wasn't just the color. The clouds weren't moving. They hung there, perfectly still, frozen like a painting. The birds, too, 3 of them, caught mid-flight, their wings stretched wide. I blinked hard and rubbed my eyes, but nothing changed. It was as if the entire world outside had hit pause. I stepped onto the balcony, half expecting the illusion to shatter, but the stillness remained. The air felt wrong. heavy like a blanket wrapped too tightly around my lungs. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint whistle of my kettle inside. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sky snapped back to normal. The clouds drifted lazily again, and the birds flapped their wings, continuing their flight as though nothing had happened. I told myself it was a weird trick of my eyes, maybe a lingering hangover from the night before. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The next day, it wasn't the sky. It was the people. I was walking to work, weaving through the usual morning rush of commuters. Everything felt ordinary until I turned a corner and saw a man standing perfectly still in the middle of the sidewalk. He was dressed in a gray suit, a leather briefcase dangling from one hand. His face was tilted upward, eyes wide open, staring at nothing. For a moment, I thought he might be having a medical episode. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. He didn't respond. I reached out to touch his shoulder, but stopped when I noticed something odd. He wasn't breathing. His chest didn't rise or fall, and his skin was unnervingly pale, almost waxy. Then I noticed the others. A woman frozen mid-stride, her phone held to her ear. A cyclist paused in mid-pedal, balanced impossibly on one wheel. A child in a red coat standing on the corner, a bubble of gum frozen mid-pop. The entire street had come to a halt. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. The only sound was the faint rush of wind through the trees. Then, as suddenly as it had happened, life resumed. The man in the suit blinked, adjusted his tie, and continued walking. The cyclist sped past. The woman on the phone laughed at something unheard, and the child's gum popped. I stood there, trembling, trying to process what I'd just seen. The world carried on oblivious. For the next week, the incidents grew stranger. Objects started appearing in places they shouldn't be. A pair of muddy boots showed up in my bathroom one morning, boots I'd never seen before in my life. My alarm clock started ringing at odd times, always flashing 3:14 a.m., no matter how many times I reset it. Then came the reflections. It happened one night as I was brushing my teeth. I leaned forward to spit, and when I looked back up, my reflection didn't move. I froze. The face in the mirror stared back at me, perfectly still, but the eyes weren't mine. They were darker, deeper, filled with something vast and unknowable. My reflection tilted its head a fraction of a second before I did. I dropped the toothbrush and backed out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut. When I finally worked up the courage to look again, everything was normal. But the sense of wrongness had burrowed into me like a splinter. The final straw came 3 nights later. I woke up to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was a dream, a low, murmuring chorus that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But as I blinked myself awake, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but they carried a strange rhythm, like a language that wasn't meant to be heard by human ears. I sat up, my heart pounding, and realized the whispers were coming from the living room. Grabbing my phone as a makeshift weapon, I crept toward the sound, every instinct screaming at me to run the other way. When I reached the living room, I saw them. Figures, tall and thin, their edges flickering like static, stood in a loose circle around my coffee table. There were 7 of them, their heads bent forward as if they were examining something I couldn't see. The whispers stopped the moment I entered the room. One by one, the figures turned to look at me. Their faces weren't faces. They were shifting patterns, swirling and fractal, like looking into the depths of a kaleidoscope. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then one of them stepped forward. Its movements were slow, deliberate, like it was testing the boundaries of reality itself. When it reached me, it raised a hand, long and skeletal, with too many joints, and pressed it against my forehead. The world dissolved. I don't know how to describe what happened next. I wasn't in my apartment anymore, or even in my body. I was somewhere vast and empty, surrounded by endless patterns of light and color that moved in ways I couldn't comprehend. The figures were there, too, but they weren't solid anymore. They were part of the patterns, or maybe the patterns were part of them. And then I heard it, a single word, echoing through the void, spoken in that same alien rhythm. Error. When I woke up, I was lying on my living room floor. The coffee table was gone, and so were the figures. But the world hasn't felt right since. The sky flickers sometimes like a screen on the verge of breaking. People move in strange, jittery ways, their smiles too wide, their eyes too blank. And at night, I hear the whispers growing louder, like they're drawing closer. I think I'm a glitch. I don't think I'm supposed to be here. Let's start a new story. I first noticed it late at night while brushing my teeth. At first, I thought it was coming from outside. Maybe a neighbor's generator or a distant car engine idling. But when I opened the window to check, the sound didn't get louder or softer. It was steady, low, and resonant, like a tuning fork vibrating somewhere just beyond the edge of perception. I shrugged it off as a fluke. By the time I climbed into bed, it was gone. The next morning, I forgot about it. Work kept me busy, and the day blurred into the kind of monotony that leaves no room for strange noises. It wasn't until later that evening, as I stood in the kitchen making tea, that I heard it again. That same low hum, faint but insistent, vibrating in the air like the room itself was alive. I turned off the kettle, held my breath, and listened. It seemed to be coming from the walls, but when I pressed my ear against them, the sound didn't change. It wasn't inside the walls. It wasn't in the air. It was just there, everywhere. I told myself it was tinnitus. Stress, maybe. But over the next few days, it grew louder, and I started noticing other things. Small things at first. My keys weren't where I left them. I'd find them on the kitchen table when I distinctly remembered tossing them onto the entryway shelf. The milk in the fridge tasted off, not sour, just wrong. Like it wasn't milk at all, but something pretending to be. One night, I noticed my reflection in the bathroom mirror wasn't moving quite in sync with me. When I raised my hand, it followed, but there was the tiniest delay, a hesitation that sent a shiver down my spine. I stared at it for a long time, but when I blinked, it was back to normal. The hum grew louder. By the end of the week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just the sound. It was the way the world itself seemed to be shifting. My apartment looked the same, but it felt shallower, like a painting I could poke through if I tried hard enough. The floor creaked in places it never had before, and shadows stretched just a little too far, lingering long after the light had moved. And then there was the elevator. The elevator in my building had always been slow, but reliable. I usually took the stairs, but that day, my arms were full of groceries, so I pressed the button and waited. When the doors opened, the hum hit me full force, rattling my teeth and making my vision blur. I stepped inside hesitantly, balancing the bags on my hip as the doors slid shut. The hum didn't fade. If anything, it grew louder, vibrating through the soles of my shoes. I pressed the button for my floor, but the elevator didn't move. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. I was plunged into darkness. I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight, but before I could, the elevator jolted. Not up, not down, just a sharp, unnatural lurch that left my stomach in my throat. The hum shifted, deepening into something guttural, almost a growl. And then the lights came back on, but it wasn't the same elevator. The walls were no longer the familiar scratched metal, but smooth, black stone that seemed to absorb the light. The buttons on the panel were gone, replaced by symbols I didn't recognize, twisting, alien shapes that hurt to look at. The floor beneath me pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. I dropped the groceries. They hit the floor with a sound that was wrong. Too loud, too sharp, like a glass shattering in an empty church. I backed into the corner, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the doors opened. It wasn't my floor. The hallway stretched impossibly far, longer than the building should have been able to contain. The walls were the same black stone as the elevator, lined with doors. Hundreds of them, all identical, all shut tight. The hum was deafening now, resonating through the hallway like a living thing. I don't know why I stepped out. Some part of me wanted to stay in the elevator, to slam the close door button and pray it would take me back to safety. But the air in the hallway was pulling at me, thick and insistent, like a current dragging me forward. The elevator doors slid shut behind me, and when I turned to press the button, they were gone. Just a smooth expanse of stone where the elevator had been. I don't know how long I walked. The hallway never ended, and the hum never stopped. Occasionally, I thought I heard something behind one of the doors, a faint whisper or a soft scratching, like nails on wood. Once, I thought I saw one of the doorknobs turn, but I didn't stop to look. Eventually, I came to a door that was slightly ajar. Light spilled out into the hallway, warm, golden light that felt out of place in the cold, oppressive dark. I hesitated, then pushed it open. It was my apartment. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The couch, the coffee table, the framed photos on the wall. The hum was gone. For a moment, I thought it was over, that somehow I'd found my way back. But then I noticed the reflection. The hallway mirror near the entryway had always been a little warped, the kind of imperfection that gave it character. But now, my reflection was too perfect. It stood a little too still, its eyes fixed on mine even when I turned my head. And then it smiled. I hadn't smiled. I backed away, my chest tightening, as the reflection stepped forward. It didn't break the glass. It just slid through it, its movements fluid and unnatural. It stood there, watching me, its face identical to mine, but wrong in ways I couldn't quite place. I ran. I don't know where I am now. The hallway never ends, and the doors are all locked. The hum is louder than ever, like it's inside me, rattling my bones. Sometimes I think I hear footsteps behind me, but when I turn around, there's nothing there, except my own shadow, smiling. Let's start a new story. As I leaned against the rusted railing, looking down at the icy water below. The bridge wasn't famous, not a tourist attraction or even a landmark. It was just a crumbling overpass in the woods, the kind of place teenagers go to drink cheap beer and write their names in spray paint. But that night, it was quiet, and quiet was what I needed. I'd been driving aimlessly for hours, trying to outrun the gnawing emptiness that had settled in my chest. The bridge felt like a natural stopping point, a place where the world dropped away for a moment. I parked my car on the shoulder and walked to the center, breathing in the crisp, sharp air. The water below was barely visible in the moonlight, a black ribbon winding through the trees. And then I heard her voice. Beautiful, isn't it? I jumped, spinning around to see a woman standing a few feet away. She was leaning casually against the railing, her face tilted up to the sky. I hadn't heard her approach, and I was certain I'd been alone. Sorry, she said, smiling faintly. Didn't mean to scare you. It's fine, I lied, my pulse still hammering. She was striking in a way that didn't quite make sense. Her hair was long and dark, almost too dark, like it absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. Her skin was pale, her lips slightly chapped, and her eyes were off. I couldn't figure out why at first. Then it hit me. They were too light, almost silver, and they didn't seem to focus on anything. What brings you here? She asked, her voice soft and unhurried. I hesitated, unsure how much to share with a stranger. Just needed to clear my head. She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. It's a good spot for that. Quiet, peaceful. Her gaze shifted to the water below. This place has seen a lot. I didn't know what to say to that, so I stayed silent. I used to come here all the time, she continued. Years ago. It was different then. Less graffiti, more trees. But the feeling's the same. There was something in her tone, an edge of sadness, maybe nostalgia, that made me uneasy. I glanced at her hands resting on the railing. Her nails were clean, but the skin beneath them was raw, almost bruised. You're not from around here, are you? She asked suddenly, her eyes snapping back to me. No, I admitted. Just passing through. She smiled again, and this time, it didn't quite reach her eyes. That's good. You don't want to stay here too long. Before I could respond, she turned and started walking toward the other side of the bridge. I watched her go, something in the pit of my stomach urging me to call out, to ask her what she meant. But I didn't. Instead, I went back to my car and drove away, the encounter replaying in my mind like a song stuck on repeat. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I searched for information about the bridge, hoping to find a clue, anything to explain the strange conversation. And I found it. The bridge was infamous, but not for anything good. Over the past decade, there had been at least 6 deaths there, all ruled suicides. The most recent was a young woman, barely out of her 20s, who had jumped 2 years earlier. The photo accompanying the article made my blood run cold. It was her, the woman from the bridge. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. It wasn't possible. I'd spoken to her. I'd seen her. She was real, wasn't she? For days, I tried to convince myself it was a mistake, a coincidence, or my mind playing tricks on me. But then the dreams started. In the dreams, I was back on the bridge. The air was colder, heavier, and the water below wasn't water anymore. It was something darker, alive, twisting, and writhing like a living thing. She was always there, standing at the edge, her back to me. "You shouldn't have come here," she'd whisper, her voice echoing in my head like it was coming from inside me. I'd wake up gasping, the scent of damp earth clinging to my skin. The final straw came 2 weeks later. I was driving home late at night, the road eerily empty when my headlights flickered. For a brief moment, the darkness swallowed everything, and when the lights came back on, she was standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. My heart pounded as the car skidded to a stop just inches from where she stood. But when I looked again, she was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep much at all after that. And now, I'm writing this because I don't know what else to do. I keep hearing her voice, soft and insistent, whispering just at the edge of my consciousness. "You shouldn't have come here." I've started seeing her in reflections, windows, mirrors, even puddles on the sidewalk. Always watching, always waiting. I don't know what she wants, but I can feel her pulling me back, like the bridge has become a part of me. And sometimes, late at night, I catch myself thinking about going back. Just for a moment, just to see. But I know if I do, I won't leave again. Let's start a new story. I was walking home from work, a late shift that had stretched past midnight, leaving the streets empty and silent. The orange glow of the streetlights flickered against the pavement as I passed under them, my shadow stretching long in front of me. At least I thought it was my shadow. Something about it was wrong. The proportions were off. Its head seemed slightly too large, its arms hanging too low. When I stopped walking, it didn't. It kept moving just for a fraction of a second before snapping still. I laughed it off, chalking it up to exhaustion, and kept walking. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. The next day was uneventful. Work, coffee, emails, everything mundane, normal. I'd nearly forgotten about the shadow until I was brushing my teeth before bed. As I leaned over the sink, rinsing my mouth, I saw it behind me in the mirror. Not a reflection, a shadow, darker than the dim light of the bathroom could explain, standing just behind me. It wasn't shaped like me. Its edges were sharper, its movements slow, deliberate, like it knew I was watching. When I spun around, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep much that night. The next few days were subtle, the kind of subtle that worms its way into your head and grows roots. I'd catch glimpses of the shadow in my peripherals, just outside my bedroom window or in the glass door of the fridge. I'd hear faint sounds at night, like someone pacing in the hallway, the boards creaking under deliberate, measured steps. One morning, I woke up to find my front door unlocked. By then, I was convinced it was my mind playing tricks on me. Stress, I told myself. Lack of sleep. My apartment was secure, my routines intact. Everything could be explained if I just stayed calm, grounded, rational. Until the voicemail. I hadn't even heard the phone ring. When I noticed the missed call, the number was unlisted. There was no message notification at first, but as I stared at the screen, it buzzed in my hand. A new voicemail. The recording was short, only a few seconds. No voice, no words, just static and something faint behind it. Breathing maybe, or wind. And then, right at the end, a voice almost too faint to catch. Come closer. That's when I started sleeping with the lights on. It didn't help. The shadow became bolder. I'd see it standing at the end of the hallway, just out of reach of the light. It would stay there, still as death, until I blinked. Then it would be closer, never moving, but somehow always advancing. I tried everything to catch it. Cameras, motion sensors, even the stupid salt around the bed trick I'd read online. Nothing worked. The cameras glitched whenever it appeared, the motion sensors never registered anything, and the salt line was undisturbed when I woke up. Except for the footprints. They weren't human. The prints were long and narrow, with too many toes and deep gouges where claws had sunk into the floorboards. They started at the edge of the salt circle and ended at the foot of my bed. The next night, I woke up to it standing beside me. It didn't have eyes, but I could feel it watching. Its shadow stretched across the bed, darker and deeper than the night around it, a void that swallowed the light. I couldn't move. My body felt like it had been pinned down, frozen in place while my chest heaved with shallow, frantic breaths. The shadow leaned closer, its form flickering like smoke, and I felt its breath against my ear, cold, damp, and heavy. "You're almost ready," it whispered. And then it was gone. The next morning, the footprints led from my bed to the door. I called out of work and spent the day researching, digging through forums and articles for anything that made sense. I found stories, threads, mentions of shadow figures and sleep paralysis, but none of it fit. The thing in my apartment wasn't just watching me, it was waiting. For what? I didn't know. Last night, I woke up somewhere else. Not my bed, not my apartment. Somewhere vast and empty. A landscape of ash and bone under a sky so black it felt alive. The air was thick, choking, and I could barely stand. Shadows stretched across the horizon, shapes flickering and shifting in the distance. It was there, the shadow. It was waiting for me, towering and immense, its form unraveling like smoke caught in a storm. "It's time," it said, the words scraping against the inside of my skull. I woke up screaming. This morning, there was ash on my pillow. The footprints in the hallway have doubled, and the voicemail is back. This time, it's not static. It's my voice, repeating the same words over and over. "Come closer, come closer, come closer." I think I finally understand. It isn't following me. It isn't haunting me. It's pulling me in. Let's start a new story with the buzz of lawnmowers and distant laughter. I was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of marinara, when Maya came home. She swept through the door like a summer storm, her hair tousled and her cheeks flushed. "Long day?" I asked, setting the spoon down. "Exhausting," she said, tossing her bag onto the couch and kicking off her heels with practiced ease. But there was something different about her tonight. It wasn't exhaustion. It was energy, humming just beneath her skin. She paced the room, her phone still in her hand, like she couldn't wait for something, someone. She was different lately. Not in an obvious way, not like the way movies portray cheaters with lipstick stains and whispery phone calls. Maya was smart, careful, but people like her forget the smaller things, the details that don't seem like they matter. It started with her laughter. Maya used to laugh with her whole body, a throw your head back, crinkled eye kind of laugh. But in the past few weeks, it had changed. Softer, almost restrained, like she was holding something back. I didn't know what yet, but I knew it wasn't for me. Then there were the pictures. Maya loved photography. It was her thing. She used to flood her Instagram with candid shots of us. Half-eaten pizza slices, my terrible attempts at cooking, a lazy Sunday morning wrapped in blankets. But now her camera roll was a gallery of empty skies and over-edited sunsets. None of us. None of me. I wasn't stupid, but I wasn't reckless either. So I started paying attention. Not in an overt way. Not yet. Just observing. A text she'd delete before I could glance over. The way her phone stayed face down on the counter, even when we were alone. The strange new habit of perfume right before leaving for her evening runs. Maya never ran. She was more of a yoga Netflix kind of person. One night, she came home late, way past midnight. I stayed awake, pretending to read a book, while she walked in wearing the same clothes she'd left in that morning, now slightly rumpled. "Sorry," she murmured, not meeting my eyes. "Work drinks ran late." I nodded, keeping my voice light. "Oh, anyone I know?" Her response was delayed, a half-second too long. "Just the usual crowd. You know how it is." She didn't elaborate. I tried to bury it, but that night, her phone buzzed 3 times in rapid succession. She always kept it on silent, so the vibrations seemed deafening in the dark. She didn't check it. She didn't move. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I should. The tipping point came 2 weeks later. Maya was always fiercely private about her laptop. She said it was her sanctuary, a workspace she didn't want disrupted. But one afternoon, she forgot to close it, and I noticed a name, an email notification. Leo, 8:15 p.m. dinner? It wasn't that the name was unfamiliar. It was how familiar it felt. My mind leapt to every little excuse, every casual mention of a work buddy. I told myself I wouldn't snoop, but the cursor hovered over the email app longer than it should have. When she came back into the room, I slammed the lid shut, heart pounding. That weekend, I made up an excuse to stay home while Maya went out again, some work event she casually mentioned. She didn't push back, didn't even hesitate. She kissed me goodbye and left without her usual, "I'll text you later." I sat in the quiet of our apartment, staring at her toothbrush in the holder. It was new, blue. Her old one had been purple. I decided I couldn't do it anymore, the waiting, the guessing. I had to know. I grabbed my coat, left the house, and followed her. It was the first time in our 7 years together that I'd done something like this, and every step felt like crossing some invisible line. She wasn't at a work event. She was sitting in an outdoor cafe with him, Leo. I knew it was him before I even saw his face. Something about the way she leaned forward, her hand brushing his, was unmistakable. They looked like a couple who hadn't learned how to hide their attraction yet. All stolen glances and lingering touches. I stayed hidden across the street, watching them laugh over shared dessert. And for the first time in weeks, I saw her smile. Her real smile, the one I thought had been mine. When she came home that night, she looked tired, disheveled. "How was the event?" I asked, careful to keep my voice neutral. "Fine," she said. "Kind of boring, actually." I didn't confront her then. I wanted to, but the words didn't come. Instead, I nodded, smiled, and told her goodnight. But the next morning, I packed a bag. I wasn't dramatic about it. I didn't leave a note or throw her things across the floor. I just left with only one text. I know. Hours later, my phone buzzed. I didn't answer. Let her stew. Let her try to figure out which part of her carefully constructed facade had crumbled first. By the end of the week, I moved into a friend's place. And while the pain didn't fade immediately, a strange clarity settled in. I wasn't angry anymore, just done. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't walking away. It's knowing when staying is no longer worth it. Let's start a new story. You'd miss it if you didn't know it was there. Half hidden behind a tangle of trees, its shingles weathered gray, the windows clouded with grime. It looks like a place where time forgot to move forward. A relic. I didn't grow up in this town, so when I moved here last year, I didn't know the unspoken rule. Don't go near the Harrington house. I first saw it on a jog. I just passed the intersection of Pine and Ridge when the house loomed into view, its roof barely visible over the treetops. Something about it caught my attention, a strange pull that made me stop in my tracks. It wasn't just the way it looked, abandoned, lonely. It was something deeper, a feeling that I couldn't shake. Like it was watching me. I asked my neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, about it a few days later while I was mowing my lawn. She went stiff, her cheerful demeanor disappearing in an instant. "Stay away from that place," she said, her voice low and serious. "Nothing good comes from poking around up there." When I pressed her, she clammed up, muttering something about bad history and some things being best left alone. I could see the fear in her eyes. It wasn't just small-town superstition. She believed whatever she was saying. That should have been enough to warn me off. But it wasn't. The first time I went to the house, I told myself I was just curious. I parked a few streets away and cut through a stretch of woods until I reached the edge of the property. Up close, the house looked even worse. Sagging porch steps, peeling paint, an upstairs window that hung crookedly in its frame. The front door was slightly ajar, its rusted hinges leaning awkwardly. I hesitated, but the pull I'd felt before was stronger now, irresistible. I stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath my weight, and pushed the door open. Inside, it smelled like mildew and rot. The air was thick, heavy, as though it hadn't been disturbed in decades. The entryway opened into a long hallway, the walls lined with faded wallpaper that had peeled away in jagged strips. A staircase with missing balusters led to the second floor, and to my right, a parlor filled with sagging furniture sat in eerie stillness. I told myself I'd just take a quick look and leave. But the moment I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The sound was so loud it echoed through the house, reverberating in my chest. I spun around, my heart pounding, and grabbed the handle. It wouldn't budge. I jiggled it harder, pulling and twisting, but it was stuck fast. Something clattered behind me. I turned slowly, my stomach knotting. The sound had come from the parlor. A broken teacup lay on the floor, shards scattered in front of a rotting coffee table. But the table was empty. There hadn't been a teacup there when I first looked. The air grew colder, biting into my skin. I could feel it now, the house pressing in around me, alive in a way I couldn't explain. And then I heard it, a voice, faint and brittle, like the wind through dry leaves. "You shouldn't be here." It came from upstairs. I didn't want to go up there. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to break a window if I had to, but my legs moved on their own. I climbed the stairs, each step groaning under my weight, the darkness at the top of the landing swallowing the weak light from below. The second floor was worse than the first. The hallway was lined with doors, all of them slightly open, revealing slivers of darkness beyond. The voice came again, whispering from the end of the hall. "Why did you come?" My mouth was dry. I couldn't answer. I stepped forward, drawn toward the last door, which was open wider than the others. The air grew colder with each step, and I could feel something watching me, unseen but undeniable. When I reached the door, I peered inside. It was a child's bedroom. A small bed with a threadbare quilt sat beneath a window, the curtains yellowed with age. A wooden rocking horse, its paint chipped and faded, stood in the corner. And there, on the bed, sat a boy. He couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a buttoned shirt and suspenders, his shoes scuffed and dusty. His head was bowed, his face hidden behind a curtain of dark hair. "Are you lost?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. He just sat there, rocking slightly, his hands clutching something in his lap. A doll. Its porcelain face was cracked, its eyes wide and staring. "I can help you," I said, stepping into the room. The boy lifted his head. His eyes were black, completely black, with no whites, no irises, just endless voids. His mouth stretched into a grin, impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. "You can't leave now," he said, his voice layered with something deeper, something ancient and wrong. The rocking horse began to move on its own, the creaking of wood filling the room. The walls shuddered, the faded wallpaper peeling away to reveal something pulsing beneath. Raw, fleshy, alive. The floor buckled, and I stumbled back, falling into the hallway. I scrambled to my feet and ran. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly, the doors slamming shut as I passed. The whispers followed me, growing louder, overlapping until they were a deafening roar. When I reached the front door, it flew open on its own, spilling me onto the porch. I didn't stop to question it. I ran, tearing through the woods until I reached my car. When I looked back, the house was gone, just an empty lot where it had been. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found something on my porch. A doll, its porcelain face cracked, its eyes wide and staring.